All right, I think that means we are live. Shalom, shalom, friends, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. I notice we already have 8 people viewing, which is pretty, obviously that's not a huge number, but considering the fact that this show can sometimes only actually have 8 live viewers total, the fact that we're getting 8 live viewers at 8 a.m. in the morning, or 10 a.m. probably for the majority of you, is pretty nice. I appreciate that. And of course, hopefully that'll be growing. They usually do once we get the ball rolling. So shalom, guys. Thank you very much for being here today. I, of course, appreciate having any sort of an audience. This is going to be a very special episode, actually second consecutive day where we actually got the luxury and blessing, thank the Lord, of being able to actually interview somebody. Yesterday, of course, we had our interview with Chris Date on the subject of annihilationism. By the way, anybody wants to check that out, it's about 2.5 hours. That'll be our episode 91 posted yesterday. Very good conversation, but can't say too much about it because it's an entirely different conversation than what we're talking about today. So we'll leave it there if you guys want to check it out. I also want to go ahead and let you guys know there are a couple things still to be looking forward to, even after today. I will be interviewing Bruce Gore next week. Bruce Gore, for those of you who do not know, is he's a Sunday school teacher for adults and a church historian. And he has quite a following here on YouTube, about 30,000 subscribers. That's where his main claim to fame would be. And he's going to provide for us next week, not any sort of a refutation or anything like that. He's not in a debate, but he does believe the conventional Exodus, and he wants to provide for us the case for that. Also, though, we're currently in talks with Douglas Petrovich, Dr. Douglas Petrovich, and he actually wants to do an interview with us specifically talking about the reformation of the new chronology, which is, and we'll get to what the new chronology and all that all means, because obviously we do have David Rohl as our guest, but that'll be interesting for me because I, as you guys may know, am not coming at David Rohl's position today with skepticism, right? This is something that I've well accepted at this point, right? So it'll be interesting to hear Dr. Petrovich's responses. I know some of them, and I'll even ask some of them today, just as sort of challenges, but nothing that's ever been terribly convincing to me. So it'll be interesting to actually speak with him, in a sense, face to face. And of course, he's a very brilliant man, so he'll be able to provide the counter case much better than anything I would be able to. So that'll be nice as well. And some other things that may or may not be happening soon. We'll see if we have a debate with Matt Slick on annihilation. That may happen, it may not. And we'll also be seeing about potentially an interview with him. Last thing I want to announce, just to remind you guys, July 1st, the Gospel Truth YouTube channel, I will be debating Robert Rowe on the question of whether or not the flood was global, at least according to the Bible. It won't be a science-based conversation. It will be strictly talking about what the text itself says. And there's an important reason to discuss that, right? Obviously, if the science indicates one thing and the text indicates another, then from a religious perspective, the text is wrong. From a historical perspective, it's a mythologized account that's recording something in the past. But from a religious perspective, it's not actually infallible anymore, right? So it is an important question to ask, and we'll be debating that July 1st, which gives you guys obviously an awful lot of time to plan. That's all the announcements that we actually have today. I want to go ahead and jump right into our prayer so we can jump right into this conversation. Ain't no reason whatsoever to be keeping our guests waiting today. And this is going to be a really fun one. So let's go ahead and jump right into that. And if you guys would like to join me, of course, I would certainly encourage you to do so. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to make this video, Lord. I want to thank you for the opportunity to have any of this research, Lord Jesus, and the ability to actually go around and talk about these sorts of things. I mean, I pray it often, but it truly is amazing to me, Lord, how I can speak to somebody in Spain at the moment and live. It's just such an incredible thing. It's a thing that is so rare in human history, really only half century old. And even then it's not internet, Lord. It's just an amazing thing. And I just thank you that I get to be somebody who partakes in this amazing thing and use it to your glory. And I ask that this be a good interview, Lord Jesus, that we get some good knowledge out of this, Lord. And for those of us who are believers, Lord Jesus, I pray that you let us use this as a way to get closer to you. I ask these things in Jesus Christ's name and give you the glory. Amen. All right. I see one comment so far. T Eagle, shalom. Thank you for being here. Appreciate you tremendously. Welcome to David Rohl. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great, CJ. 4 o'clock in the afternoon here, so it's I'm not quite as early as you.
Yeah, and that is honestly that was kind of one of the things that was a little bit amazing already. Just thinking about this, right? I remember, obviously it wasn't that long ago, but just one of the first things that crossed my mind when I had asked you if you'd be willing to do this was like, I wonder if, because I initially thought I might be doing it at like midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, and it'd be maybe 8 or 9 a.m. your time. And then this ended up working way better because I'm not trying to stay up till 3 a.m.
Well, I've had requests to actually be open and available at 3 o'clock in the morning my time, which is more reasonable for you. But I can't do the evening broadcasts from America. It's impossible for me because I'm Betty Buys asleep.
Right. Yeah, I feel that because I mean, like I said, I'm not even trying to do that. Right. That's way too late. I used to, do that kind of stuff not even 2 or 3 years ago. But now that I've gotten out of that habit, I really would like not to get back.
I'm way too old for that now, that game now. I used to do it when I was younger.
And that actually is a pretty decent transition into, now I highly doubt it because for the most part, people who are watching me are obviously going to be familiar with you, especially considering that I am a frequent referencer of your work. But on the offshoot, excuse me, that there is somebody here who actually doesn't know who you are. Who is David Rohl, and why would I be so interested in having a debate, or not a debate, excuse me, an interview?
Well, David Rohl is rather old now. He's 70 this year, which is quite a struggle. But when I was 7, which was quite a while ago, I got interested in ancient Egypt, and at that age, I was writing the hieroglyphs of all the kings' names down in a single column on a big sheet of paper, both in the hieroglyphs and also in the Greek versions and in the anglicized versions, giving all their dates. So I was interested in all this when I was 7 years old. I don't know why. I've not a clue why. And I went to Egypt for the very first time at the age of 9 and sailed all the way from Cairo up to Abu Simbel upstream on King Farouk's paddle steamer because he'd been thrown out of the country, kicked out in the revolution. So I got the whole boat to myself. So I discovered Egypt as a kid, really, as a child. Then I went into the music industry when I was about 15 or 16 years old, forming bands, etc. And I was in the music industry for about 25, 30 years as a recording engineer, recording artist, record producer. And at the end of that, I came back to my first love, which was Egyptology, and went to university as a mature student and got all the qualifications to become an Egyptologist, a proper Egyptologist. But of course, I had my ideas about revising chronology way back in the late 1970s. So I've been doing revised chronology, if you like, for about 30 odd years, 40 years. Are you there? I've lost you. Hello? CJ? Well, I don't know if I'm still live, but I don't know where you've gone. Do you want me to give a lecture while we're waiting? I better check. If you're still on, I'm currently just testing my speed. I've got 10 megabits, so I'm okay. So I think it's at your end. Not sure. Everything tells me that I'm still live, but I'm not entirely sure if I'm talking to myself now. think Doug Petrovich has sabotaged the show. Well, either CJ's running around like a headless chicken trying to fix things, or I'm not connected. I'm not sure which it is. I'm going to message him on Facebook Messenger. Just a second. Hold on.
All right.
Oh, well, you're back.
Sorry about so.
Who was at fault there? You or me?
That was absolutely me. As a matter of fact, I have my phone also on so I can see the live chat. You actually remained live that whole time.
Oh dear. The poor people having to listen to me umming and ahhing for all that period of time. They must have all gone to sleep by now.
Well, and by the way, if something like that does happen again, please feel free to continue on. I can't hear you. My internet was deciding it didn't want to function and I'm very sorry about that. Of all possible times, right?
Right. I hope you've got a good pair of scissors to edit that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly enough, I had a 2.5 hour interview last night. Did not have a single problem. So I hope that doesn't become a thing.
This could end up as a 24-hour interview if you're not careful.
Right.
Okay. Do you want to start again?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Did you get my little introduction about my life up to the point of going to university? Did you get all that?
Yeah. Okay. And the audience did as well.
Good.
And so with that, the follow-up question that I would want to ask is, so you're going up, right? You're interested in producing music, but of course, obviously, you're now in university. And what is the main drive? I know you were saying you were interested in hieroglyphs all the way back to being 9, but more so than just general hieroglyphs. What was like the specific thing you were studying?
Okay, well, before I went to university, while I was still a record producer, I got hold of a book by Kenneth Kitchen called The Third Intermediate Period in Egypt, which is a very complex book. It deals with the 21st to 25th dynasties, and it's the type of material that no Egyptologist likes to go near because it's very complicated. And essentially, that book was the key to understanding that there was a possible problem with Egyptian chronology, which scholars had created over the last 200 years. And by studying that book, and it wasn't just me, lots of young students at the time were also studying the book, we came to the conclusion that we needed to think again about the timeline of ancient Egypt. Now, it's important because Egyptian chronology dictates the timelines of a lot of other civilizations, because you find artifacts with Egyptian hieroglyphs on and names of kings, for instance, in Israel, in the Holy Land, or in Greece, or in Anatolia, Turkey. And of course, their chronologies are all dated via finding Egyptian artifacts, datable artifacts. So Egyptian chronology holds the key to understanding all the other chronologies of the ancient world, apart from Mesopotamian, which is Assyria and Babylonia. Those two are independent. But for instance, the biblical or archaeological timeline, if you like, which we compare to the biblical story, that timeline is dictated by Egyptian artifacts found in Israel.
And this will be much more important in a second. The audience will absolutely see why I wanted us to make sure of that in a moment. But one thing I want to point out, interestingly enough, when we're talking about this sort of thing, and I know you can comment on this, of course, much better than I can. For those who may not know in the audience, the difficult thing about chronologies can be that, and correct me if I'm wrong here, they do tend to be self-referential, right? In that you're counting 40 years from a date that you actually understand by virtue of understanding the calendar, right? So in our own example, it's 2021, meaning it's been 2021 years since the birth of Christ, but also you know the birth of Christ by understanding our calendar.
Exactly right. In fact, it's very easy to work out when something happened, like 1066, the Battle of Hastings, for instance. All Brits know that date. But it's 1066 years since the birth of Christ, although the birth of Christ itself is a bit debatable exactly when it took place, because it probably was around between 6 and 4 BC. It certainly wasn't in 0 BC or 1 BC or 1 AD. In fact, there's no 0 between the two. When it comes to working out the BC chronology, it's quite different because we have to work backwards from 0 or 1. So working backwards, we have to calculate all the different data that we have using the kings lists and the lengths of the reigns of the kings, working back into place somebody like Ramses II, for instance, in 1279 BC. That's the date scholars give to his coronation. Now, whether that is actually right or not is dependent on whether we've worked the chronology out properly.
Yeah, and so to give the audience just sort of a brief idea as to why that can be such a huge deal, right? Now, if you have this calendar and it's the only calendar you don't have maybe another calendar to synchronize it with, or if you have this calendar and you've synchronized it wrong with the other one, right? Since you didn't know that original set date, which in our case, like you were saying, it's not quite the birth of Christ, but at least it was assumed to be for a time, or believed to be for a time, right? So you don't know that date, therefore you don't know the 1066 date, and now you link that date with, say, an invasion that happened sometime in 1200. Well, now your chronology is way out of whack.
Yes. It's okay for AD, Anno Domini, everything in the period from the birth of Christ to today is pretty much okay. We can work out when anything happened, and we have synchronisms between, the relationships between America and the UK, for instance, more recently. So, we know what year it is in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, and we know what year it is in the reign of the current president of the Americas. So you can synchronize things like that. Now, when we come to the BC period, we do the same type of thing. But unfortunately, and this might be a bit of a surprise to people, we use a biblical synchronism to date Egyptian history. And that synchronism is something that a lot of people don't pay much attention to in the Bible. It's the invasion of a pharaoh called Shishak in the Bible, who sacks the Temple of Solomon in year 5 of Rehoboam, who is the son of Solomon. So it's 5 years after the death of Solomon. Now, we use the biblical date of 925 BC for that event, the sacking of the temple. And we equate that pharaoh Shishak with an Egyptian pharaoh called Shoshenq. It's a question of whether or not those two can be identified. And from that date of 925 BC, we work backwards, calculating all the king's reigns to arrive at Ramses II's date of 1279 BC. So the date for Ramses is dependent on whether the synchronism is correct. So we use a biblical date given to us in the biblical chronology that we worked out from the Bible to date Ramses II, and then we use Ramses II. All scholars use him to say, well, in his time, there was no Exodus. In his time, there was no conquest of the Promised Land. So the Bible is used to date Egyptian history, and Egyptian history is then used to debunk the Bible and say it's mythological, fictional.
And that actually is a perfect transition into my next question. So now we know why chronology can be such a fickle thing. And that leads a perfect transition into the Shishak character, right? So Shishak is not only a big figure in the Bible, but as you just revealed for us, he also turns out to be a massive figure in Egyptian chronology.
Sure.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the driving factor behind what we currently have established today as either the low or high chronologies, give or take 25 years, is partially based on synchronism of Shishak with a pharaoh called Shoshenq, right?
Well, it's the fixed point for everybody apart from revised chronologists. So all the conventional chronologies, whether they're high or low chronologies, are dependent on that anchor point. And if that anchor point is wrong, everything is wrong. So we suddenly, the whole of chronology of ancient Egypt is floating. It's no longer fixed anywhere because we don't have anything to attach it to. And the problem is that when we look at the internal evidence in Egypt for the dating of Shoshenq, he's much, much later in time. He's around 820 BC, down to about 800. So he's more than 100 years later than the biblical date. And that's based on internal evidence within Egypt. So the Bible gives us an anchor point in what we call the orthodox chronology, or the conventional chronology everybody uses. And then they use astronomy to decide whether or not we have a high or low version of that conventional chronology, which is quite different to what we call the new chronology or revised chronology. That one rejects that connection between Shoshenq and Shishak and starts from the Egyptian evidence basis, works backwards through time using the internal Egyptian evidence, and then when you do that, then you find synchronisms with the Bible which are much more satisfactory.
And that's a really interesting point that I want to get on just really quick. So you brought up the how the high and low chronology are actually distinguished by astronomical events, right? In this case, I believe it's an eclipse of some kind, but I'm not actually 100% sure about that.
It's to do with one of the Babylonian kings called Amizadaga, and then he dates Hammurabi because he's in the same dynasty, and that in turn, there's a debate as to whether or not it's earlier or later, and that all depends on whether we identify a particular eclipse in the reign of Amizadaga.
And the interesting thing about that, right, that it maybe wouldn't be so fleshed out for people who have watched your more popular stuff like the Patterns of Evidence at Exodus, sure. But what you have explained in your more scholarly work is that can kind of float around, right? It doesn't have to be in a 25-year time frame. It can be any time in a 25-year cycle.
Yes, exactly. That's basically because the lunar calendar refreshes every 25 years. So you're shoveling it around within a 25-year period. You could do 2 25 years or 3 25 years. In the case of the new chronology or the revised chronology, we're looking at probably between 250 and 300 years. So it's a much, much bigger distance in time. So almost like lunar chronology becomes a fine-tuning point. It's not really the definitive, what we call absolute chronology that we work with.
Right. And that's an important thing, I think, because I think a lot of people, when they hear that, these chronologies are actually set by stuff that we observe in the stars, I think it starts to make them think it's a lot more set in stone than it actually is. But when you start to realize that can float around in any timeline, really, so long as it's on the same cycle.
It's because it's cyclical, exactly. And the lunar cycle is 25 years. The Sothic year, the Great Sothic year, is 1,460 years, which is a very, very much more complex issue. But that's because they didn't have a leap year in Egyptian chronology. So they lost a quarter of a day every year. And so it slid against the solar year. And that's a more complex thing. But again, we don't even really know whether or not the Egyptians ever modified their chronology to adjust for this misbalance. Because as you can imagine, in half of 1,460 years, the festivals were all in the wrong time period. You know, that summer was the winter. So it would make things very, very messy. So maybe they revised it at certain points, and we don't know for sure.
And thank you for that. And so with that, now we have a new question, right? Which is why would we, number one, what would make lead you to believe that Shishak is not Shoshenq? And number two, who is Shishak?
Okay, those are two big questions. That'll take a bit of explaining. Well, the first thing is that if we look at the evidence of Shoshenq, our Egyptian name, he's the founder of the 22nd dynasty. He has a big inscription at Karnak, a campaign inscription, which Champollion came when he first deciphered the hieroglyphs to read. And he identified a name ring and a whole series of name rings that we have at different places in the Holy Land or in what we call Syro-Palestine. And at that place, he translated as Yehud Hamalkuth, or Judah the Kingdom. But modern scholars read it as Yad Hamelech, which means hand of the king. It doesn't actually have anything to do with Judah. And when you look at where it is in the sequence of toponyms, it's nowhere near Judah. It's right up in the Jezreel Valley. It's up near Megiddo. So it's quite clear that Champollion made a big mistake there. But ever since that time when he identified it as Judah the Kingdom and identified Shishak and Shoshenq as one person, with the biblical Shishak who came and sacked the temple of Solomon and invaded the kingdom of Judah, that mistake has stuck with us. It's been with us all the way through, and Egyptologists still follow it today, and biblical scholars still follow it today. In fact, you'll find all the Israeli scholars refer to Shoshenq as Shishak. They never refer to him as Shoshenq. So they've assumed that it's the same person when it isn't. In fact, when you look at the details of that campaign, first of all, Jerusalem is not mentioned in it. We have hundreds of names there of different places. Jerusalem doesn't appear there at all. It should be between Gibeon and Mahanaim, and there's nothing there. There's no gap or destruction where Jerusalem could have been. And secondly, the whole concentration of Shoshenq's campaign is in the kingdom of Israel, where the Bible tells us that Shishak's campaign was against the kingdom of Judah. So they are totally different. It's like apples and oranges. They are not the same thing.
And then so when we move on to the second portion of that, because now that seems like pretty convincing evidence, and especially the Jerusalem part, because I don't think scholars typically there's a lot about the Davidic era that they dispute. One of them doesn't tend to be that Jerusalem was a large and pretty successful city.
Sure. Yeah.
And so since that one can be one that we can seemingly accept, it would make a lot of sense. Shoshenq is supposed to be attacking the city. He doesn't attack the city. Rather, he actually attacks his ally, seemingly. This all seems very odd.
Well, that's exactly it. And it's key to the whole issue, isn't it? Because when you look at the archaeology of Jerusalem in the period where conventionally they place Solomon, there is no great city there, no rich civilization, no great merchant king that we know of the three great kings of the United Monarchy period. There's no great David conqueror. There's no great period of wealth under Solomon, because he's placed in the Iron Age because of all this issue that we've been talking about, that Ramses II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, according to Cecil B. DeMille and everybody who's followed him. So we end up with Solomon in the Iron Age, when the Iron Age is okay at certain periods, but the time where most people place him, it's not that great. But if you place him if we revise the chronology and we shorten it down by something like 300 years, we bring it down in time towards the present, then the late Bronze Age also comes down, because as I said before, they date the late Bronze Age and the Middle Bronze Age via Egyptian artifacts. So if you find artifacts of Ramses II at Tel Megiddo or somewhere like that in the Holy Land, you date that particular phase of the late Bronze Age based on the pottery and the identification of the Egyptian pharaohs. So you're in a situation where Israel Finkelstein, for instance, places Solomon in a period where Jerusalem is a no entity. It's really nothing special at all, and which is why he calls him basically a king, a nowhere king, a nobody king. Well, that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says something completely different. So if you take those 300 years out and you slide down the late Bronze Age and Ramses II, he then synchronizes with a really, really important king of Israel, Solomon. So we end up with Ramses II and Solomon being contemporaries. Now that opens up a whole can of worms, really, because of course Pharaoh sent his daughter to marry Solomon. She was an Egyptian princess. Okay, so if Ramses II is the Pharaoh who gave his daughter to Solomon, who is that daughter? Well, we know that now because we've actually done all the research on that. But I'm not going to tell you about that because it's in my next book. You're going to have to wait for that one. But what does matter is now Solomon is in the fantastic late Bronze Age, the last phase of the late Bronze Age, which is the richest period in world history in terms of the ancient world. It's the time of the golden age of Mycenae and the Bronze Age Greeks. It's the time of the Hittites. It's the time when Solomon really would fit in as a great trading king, negotiating with Egyptians and Hittites and Mesopotamians and Greeks and doing all this trading. That would work in that period, but it doesn't work in the Iron Age when we don't have any evidence for that sort of thing. So on a general basis alone, revising the chronology places Solomon in the right time period for what we describe in the Bible.
And, so real quick, I did want to let the audience know, by the way, I see a lot of your guys' questions all being recorded, just so you guys know. We'll be asking them towards the end, a lot like last night if you were here last night. But so back to this very interesting point, right? So, and that gives us some very good and solid general information. I think that is something that I think in a circumstantial way can lead people to start getting an inkling. But you got some much more solid evidence that Shishak is Ramses, don't you?
Well, yes, it's a linguistic question, and I hope your audience is not confused already. But let's start with the name Ramesses, shall we? That's a Greek name. Okay, we borrowed it from the Greeks. When you look at the actual name in Egyptian, or how Egyptologists pronounce it, they pronounce it Ramesu. Okay, that's how it's written down in hieroglyphs. However, we have documents from the Hittite world, from Hattusha, the capital of the Hittites in Turkey, but regarding a peace treaty between Ramses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III. So we have documents not only in Egyptian hieroglyphs commemorating that peace treaty, but we also have a tablet in Istanbul Museum with the same material on it, exactly the same words, but in cuneiform. Now, in cuneiform, we have a syllabic language. Okay, it's not just a consonantal language like Egyptian hieroglyphs or Hebrew. It actually has elements like sa, ta, mu, ti, all those different things. And so when we read the name Ramesses in the Hittite version, what the Hittites themselves heard, the ambassadors who went to Egypt to do the negotiations for the treaty, they heard his name the way it was pronounced in the ancient world, not the way we read it in Egypto-speak, or you read it in Greek or in the Bible or wherever you want to call it. Okay, so his formal title name is in Egypto-speak is Uzamatre Setepenre Ramesses Meriamun. That's his full title. Okay, when we read it in Hittite, which is Akkadian, basically, because they're writing in Akkadian, in this is the diplomatic correspondence that we're dealing with. It's Washmuria Shatapnaria Riamashesha Miyamana. It sounds totally different, but that's how it really was. Yeah, Washmuria Shatapnaria Riamashesha Miyamana. Now, if you take Ramesses' element of that, it's Riamashisha. Okay, so the short form of Ramesses' name, which we find in lots of papyri, the common folk didn't go through all that nonsense trying to pronounce the whole thing. They just called him Shishak. Okay, that was his short form name, or hypochoristicon. Now, okay, it's missing the cough at the end to make Shishak. Okay, that's how the Bible writes it. But that's because the early forms of Hebrew wrote the wav on Shisha. It's a vowel marker at the end. Shisha is like a lollipop on a stick, or a popsicle, I think you call them in America. It's a loop with a stem at the bottom. That later on became the letter for cough. So a later Hebrew scribe read it as Shishak when it's actually Shisha. So we know that Ramesses II is the Shishak of the Bible, but his real name was Riamashisha, short form Shisha.
And to give kind of an example for the audience of a modern example of that, think of the 1611 King James and how it uses an I for Jesus rather than a J for Jesus. Same language, but the spelling has changed.
Exactly. But it's how you hear it that matters, not how we write it. Okay. So the Hebrew scribes, I'm thinking maybe in the time of Josiah, who was the great reformer king of Judah. And we know that a sacred scroll was found in his time. So probably around that time, the scribes are writing and making new copies of more older documents, Hebrew documents. And in the older Hebrew documents, the loop on the stem were originally read as a wav, which becomes a vowel marker for A or Shisha. Okay. Later on in the time of Josiah, that letter, that sign, is actually a kof or a K. So it becomes Shishak. So they misread it. And that's why we think Shoshenq and Shishak are the same person, rather than Ramesses II Shisha and the real Shishak.
Yeah, and it is interesting too, because you hear a lot of people immediately kind of buy the Shishak Shoshenq thing on the basis that they sound so similar. But Shishak and Shisha sound a great deal more similar, it might seem, just missing that one letter.
Well, it's clear, because if we look at the Akkadians from later on, the Akkadians pronounce Shoshenq Susinku, which sounds totally different to Shishak.
Right. And that's an interesting point. I was actually going to ask at one point towards the end, and now I won't have to, how the Hebrews might have actually pronounced Shishak, and it's probably closer, I imagine, to what the Hittites did than what we have in our modern English Bibles.
Well, remember that Akkadian is a Semitic language. It's East Semitic, and the Hittites are writing in that language because it's the diplomatic language of the day, the lingua franca. But so they actually heard it as Shisha. So the Hebrews and the Israelites would have said Shisha. They wouldn't have said Shishak.
And so with that new identification, that does, and interestingly, it does keep Ramesses actually kind of as an interesting figure, which he always probably would be, considering the awesomeness of his reign. But rather than the Prince of Egypt being filmed, I guess, as DreamWorks movie with Moses, it's now DreamWorks movie with Solomon.
Yeah. No,
But
I
with
think it's
that,
great. Just think about it. You've got Ramesses the Great and Solomon the Great, contemporary with each other, son-in-law of the elder king in Egypt. It's a perfect thing. And Ramesses II has got his first daughter that was born to him becomes the wife of Solomon. It's amazing.
and so with that, then what we end up now having for the purposes of the Exodus, right, is not necessarily. And correct me if I'm wrong here. You don't necessarily revise the biblical side of it. In other words, you do take an early date of 1450. It's the Egyptian side that ends up being revised. Is that correct?
That's correct. But of course, most scholars don't accept the 1446 or 1450 BC round numbers date for the Exodus. They put it in the reign of Ramesses II, because in the biblical text, the first chapter of Exodus, it talks about them building a store city of Ramesses. So they end up saying, well, he must be the pharaoh of the Exodus, and of course he's dated to 1279 BC, so the Exodus must be 1250 BC or around that time, instead of 1450 BC or around that time. But the Bible says it was 1446 to be accurate. 1446 BC, 480 years after the foundation of the Temple of Solomon, is when the Exodus took place. Now, with conventional chronology and with the Egyptologists and the biblical scholars, they ignore that and compress it down to half that period of time in order to accommodate the fact that Ramesses II is the pharaoh of the Exodus. Well, once you've got that out of your head and say, no, he's not, Ramesses II is contemporary with Solomon, then we can look back to 446 BC to see where that takes us.
And at that point, where does that take us, actually? When we go 480 years before the reign of Ramses, right?
Yeah.
What on the Egyptian side starts to happen?
Okay. Well, we have to think about revised chronology now. If you are a Doug Petrovich or an ABR scholar, you would move that back and look to around the time of the mid-18th dynasty in Egypt, which is around the time of Imhotep II, and that's what Doug thinks was the period of the Exodus, and he's the pharaoh of the Exodus. I don't agree with that, because I believe we have to revise Egyptian chronology, as I've already explained that to you, that we need to revise it by around 300 years. So if we're shortening Egyptian chronology by 300 years, the 18th dynasty is being shortened by 300 years. It's coming down in date towards this new date for Ramesses II, who's no longer in 1279 BC, is 979 BC. So he's much, much later in time. So you're moving all the earlier dynasties down in date. So for 1446 BC, in this new revised dating, becomes the end of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, which is the 13th dynasty. Now, I could show you that visually if that's useful to you. Do you want to have some computer sharing at this stage?
Absolutely, that would be perfect.
Oh, well, if I'm going to do this, it's quite tricky. So I'll hit the share button, then I'll locate some relevant pictures to show you how that shift in time works. In fact, I'll use the patterns of evidence wall of time, if that's helpful to visualize how it works. So let me hit the share button and we'll see if we can get this going.
Yeah, absolutely.
So share screen. Let's go through all these routines. Application window, I think it is, isn't it?
Well, so on the
I'm sharing now.
Yeah,
can you see the screen? Can you see my screen?
Sure. Yes, sir. And now it is up, actually, so the audience should be able to see it as well.
Okay. Now, if I hit play, we'll end up with a full screen. And I'm just going to move through the first title. I've just prepared a few things for you to see. So when you look at those of you who have seen the Patterns of Evidence movie, they know that they choose, I think it's 6 elements of the story of the sojourn through to Exodus and conquest. So they have the arrival in Egypt in the time of Jacob in the second year of the famine, and then the multiplication is when they have the Israelite population becomes bigger and bigger, and then they fall into slavery, and then of course after the slavery period we have the judgment, which is the great plagues of Exodus, and the final part of that is the Exodus itself, then the 40 years of the wandering in the wilderness, and then we come to Joshua and the conquest. So those elements that you see on that wall there are all placed in the conventional dating scheme at the time of Ramesses II. You can see Abu Simbel is on that lower row there, and you can look at the date around 1300 to 1200 BC for that sequence that you've got there. Now that's where it is in the conventional dating scheme, but when you look at the evidence, there is no evidence for any of those events either in Egypt or in the Promised Land. So if we now look at the pattern of evidence in where we do find it. And we look there, and you see on the right-hand side there, you see the conventional dating in the New Kingdom with the Exodus at the time of Ramses II. But look what happens earlier. The pattern that we see in the archaeology is much earlier in time. It's in the Middle Kingdom. So that's when we find all the evidence, for instance, for the sojourn in Egypt of the Israelites, for the Exodus, and of course the conquest of Jericho, which is a crucial key to the whole business. So really that is the thing that we have to look for, is Jericho. Jericho is everything about finding the archaeology that matches the Bible. So this is the ruined mound of Jericho. What I want to show you very quickly is what happens in the Ramesses period, the conventional dating for the Exodus and the conquest. Here on the right-hand side, you've got the archaeological periods, just so you know what they mean. LB is late bronze. So late bronze 2A, then later, a little bit later, late bronze 2B, then you have the Iron Age 1A and the Iron Age 1B. And if we put the conventional dating related to the Bible onto that archaeology, we have the sojourn coming to an end towards the late bronze 2A. We have Moses and the Exodus in late bronze 2B, which is the time of Ramesses. And then we have the early judges and then the later judges in those periods. But let's look at the Egyptian data. And you can see that now we're looking at Ramses II of the 19th dynasty is in the late bronze 2B. That is where he's fixed in archaeological terms. And he, therefore, is in the time of Moses and the Exodus. So the conquest comes sometime in that late bronze 2B or towards the end of it. But if we look at Jericho, first of all, we have in this particular part of the Jericho period around 1350, 1400 to 1350 BC, conventional dating, we have a single house on the ruin mound. The mound has been a ruin for hundreds of years, and then we have one house called the middle building built on that particular ruin. And then much later in time, in the Iron Age 1B, we have a town constructed there, and this is a new town that's built on the ruin mound. But in between, we have a gap where there's no occupation at all, and therefore that's where the conquest is placed. Look at it. At the end of the time of the late bronze 2B, after Moses and the Exodus, and Joshua comes along, he conquers a city that wasn't even there. There was no Jericho for Joshua to conquer. And that is the problem with the conventional chronology. It tells you straight away that the chronology is wrong. It cannot be right. So I'm just going to come out of this now and come back to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And let's stop screen share. And hopefully, are we back? Are you?
Yes, sir.
We all back with that. Did that make sense with it being more visual?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that is a good transition into one of the next things that I do want to ask, which is about some of the specifics. So obviously there can't be an Exodus without a group of Israelites in Egypt. So the first question I think would probably be, do we have evidence of, in this time frame, Israelites in Egypt?
Yes, of course, because if we now place Jericho, the destruction of Jericho, in that period that I just showed you, which is the actual end of the Middle Kingdom, which is the Middle Bronze Age, somewhere towards the end of the Middle Bronze Age, we have when that city was destroyed. So we have a 600-year gap then of where there's no city on there until the Iron Age city is constructed. So we know when Jericho was destroyed. It was the end of the Middle Bronze Age, towards the end of the Middle Bronze Age. And that in Egyptian terms is the Middle Kingdom, finishing with the 13th dynasty, just before the Hyksos period. So if we look at the Middle Kingdom from the 13th dynasty back to the end of the 12th dynasty, we have a massive population of what we call Western Asiatics or Semites, living in the Eastern Delta, in the land of Goshen, in that era. And it's the only time we have direct archaeological evidence for a large population of Semites in the Eastern Delta, where Goshen is located in Egyptian history, is in that Middle Bronze Age period from the end, towards the end of the 12th dynasty, towards the end of the 13th dynasty, when the Exodus took place. So Exodus at the end of the 13th dynasty, arrival of Joseph in the late 12th dynasty, and then Jacob a little bit later. And that's when we find the population suddenly of Western Asiatic peoples living in the Eastern Delta of Egypt.
And this actually is a fun fact. My first David Rohl story actually has absolutely nothing to do with either the new chronology nor patterns of evidence. As actually watching in a History Channel documentary. It was known as I can't remember what they called it. I think it was History of the Bible or something like that. But they would go through all the stories. and there's like 40 episodes. They do one on Joseph, and you were making the argument that you believe that we've actually found Joseph's Egyptian tomb, right?
We have, and his palace where he lived in, and the people that served him in that area. Do you want to have some more visuals? Shall I show you the palace and the tomb? Do you want to see them?
Yeah, if it's not too much trouble, absolutely.
No, it's fine. I'm happy with that. I'll go back to share again. I'll see if we can get this working again. So I'll go back to share screen, application window, and share. It's a bit of a routine, but it's worth it. So let me take you down to, well, let's start with the Sojourn itself. Why don't we do that?
Absolutely.
So let's look at the archaeological evidence first. Are you getting everything okay? Is it nice and clear?
Yeah. Sometimes it'll lag ever so slightly, but not anything that's causing a problem.
I've noticed that it sort of stutters a little bit, but when the stills are up, it should be fine. Right. So here's the Nile Valley. You can see the delta up on the top of the screen, just south of the Mediterranean. The land of Goshen is where that red blob is. Okay, that's the land of Goshen that's described in the Bible, and that's why we find this large population of Semites living in Egypt in the Middle Bronze Age or in the Middle Kingdom. And let's look at defining where Goshen is located. Well, it's located in the eastern delta of Egypt, so it's closest to the Promised Land. It's just across the desert of Sinai from the Holy Land. And it's the nome that the Bible calls Gesem in the well, it's the Egyptian term Gesem, which is also the Septuagint term for it. But in the Masoretic text, it's called Goshen. But Gesem is the actual name of the place. And it's located by the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, which is the easternmost branch of the Nile, separating at Cairo to form the delta. So it's the one closest to the desert, closest to the land of Palestine, Canaan. So that's where you would expect the Semites to come to, because it's nearest to their own homeland. And the place in the Middle Kingdom, the time we're talking about, was known as Avaris. But it's only later that the city of Ramses is built on top of it, and that's the one the Bible refers to as Ramses. So what the Bible is doing is, so probably again sometime around the time of Josiah, the redactor of the Bible is actually explaining where the Israelites were by the name of the place in his time rather than the name of the place when the Israelites were there. So let me give you an example of that. For instance, you say that New York was handed over by the Dutch to the British. To give you a good American example, of course, but it wasn't called New York when the Dutch had it. It was called New Amsterdam. So the same thing happens in the Bible, where they call the place Ramses because that's the name that they're familiar with in a time when the redactors written down the text or copied the text. But the ancient name they would not have known was Avaris. So the place is actually called Avaris. That's the place they built and where they lived. And this is a satellite image of the area with all the fields. The River Nile has gone there now, but it used to flow like they've done lots of 800 borehole tests to actually find where the river used to flow. And you can see it's very complex at this point. It divides up, and there are lots of turtleback islands where people lived. And in fact, we know that Avaris was located on those two southern islands there, whereas the city of Ramesses, Pir-Ramesses, was up on the northern part there. But the southern part of Pir-Ramesses was also the place we call Avaris. So the city expanded and was built on top of ancient Avaris. So the Israelite city lies below the city of Ramesses. Okay. Now, that is the place where we find all the archaeological evidence of the Hebrews. And this is typical examples. These are Israelite graves that we find there, mud brick. They were originally vaulted tombs. The one on the left-hand side there has been excavated. The one on the right-hand side is still to be excavated down to where the body is. And when you dig down to where the bodies, this is what they look like. They're lying on their sides with their knees pushed up towards their chests in the sort of semi-fetal position. That is very typical of Western Asiatic Semitic burials, not Egyptian. Egyptians were not buried like that. They were buried flat on their backs with their legs straight, and all the pottery that surrounds them, so Canaanite, typical Canaanite Semitic pottery from that period from Canaan. This typical Bronze Age axe head here, which we call a duckbill axe, is typical of the Middle Bronze 2A, which is the period we have these Israelites in Egypt. The large storage jars are typical Canaanite storage jars. They're not typically Egyptian. And we have these things called Tel El Yahadia, which are small juglets for perfumes and unguents. Again, typical of this period. So we know this is Middle Bronze 2a, that's the time that Joseph and Jacob and all the sons of Jacob lived in Egypt, in the land of Goshen. When they died, these brothers of Joseph, these chieftains, they were buried in tombs, and these tombs had pits dug in front of them where they sacrificed donkeys. And here you can see 2 large skeletons of donkeys, but also 2 sheep. So we know that these people were also shepherds. In fact, we know exactly what type of sheep these were. So zoologists, so people who have actually worked on the bones, have discovered that they belong to the long-haired Syrian sheep variety, which comes from North Syria, which of course is the area where Abraham came from. So the patriarchs actually brought their sheep that they took from that area and introduced them to Egypt for the first time, and they sacrificed them at the burials of these chieftains, these patriarchs, these sons of Jacob, as sacrificial animals. And we know from the bones that they come from the north, from the area of Haran. So when we come to Joseph now, we get much more spectacular evidence. This is the palace that he lived in that's been reconstructed from the archaeology. A very fine building, Egyptian style, but we know that the resident who lived in there was not an Egyptian, he was a Semite. So he was a Semitic person. If we look at the plan of building, it's quite complex, but the orange section at the back there, you can see, was the original dwelling of Joseph. And then there was a portico that you can see slightly to the right of the orange section, which eventually was turned into a courtyard because 2 new apartments were built on the front, the blue sections, for 2 of the sons of the guy who lived in the orange section. And we know that Joseph had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. So it looks like they had identical apartments given to them on the extension of the palace area. Now, when we look at the reconstruction again of this palace, and we turn to looking down into that courtyard, that portico that you see in front of the area of Joseph's area, it had 12 columns. And I think that represents the 12 sons or the 12 tribes of the Israelites in the time of Jacob. It's commemorative of those 12 individual sons. When we look at the model that the archaeologists produce of the rear gardens behind the palace, we see a bunch of tombs with palm trees in front of each one of them. Count the number of tombs you've got there. These are the main tombs. Well, there are 12 of them. So there are 12 pillars in the colonnade in front of the palace, and there are 12 major tombs. There's sort of smaller tombs as well for other members of the family or whatever, but there are 12 main ones. And the most important one is the one at number 12 there, because it's different to the rest, isn't it? It's a pyramid tomb. It's not a dome tomb like the others, a vaulted tomb. This is actually a pyramid tomb. That's quite extraordinary, because only kings in this period, and possibly queens, had pyramid tombs. No individuals who were not part of the royal family would have been given a pyramid tomb, but this guy who lived in this palace was buried in that pyramid tomb at the back of the garden. So the owner of the palace had a special tomb built for him. And when we look at the archaeological evidence for that tomb, this is the foundations of the tomb here. You can see it's just below the modern surface of the terrain here. That's because the local farmers have been excavating and ploughing this area for many, many centuries, and so we've lost all the upper part of the tomb. What we have left are the foundations of the tomb, which you can see there, and the burial chamber underneath. And what it is the front area is actually a chapel. Then you have a rectangular shaped foundation which was where the pyramid sat on top of it, and the tomb is buried underneath. This is a plan of it. So there you see the chapel on the right-hand side with the entrance. You see the area where the pyramid was on top, that large rectangle, and then buried underneath there was a vaulted brick chamber, a dome chamber. It was rectangular with a dome on top of it. And I'm going to take you to show you what was inside that. So here the archaeologists digging down into the burial chamber, and I want you to notice 2 things. The first is there are fragments of limestone here that have been found in the burial chamber, and they've been brought out for cleaning and examining. Also, there's this object. Behind the chapel, between the chapel and the burial chamber, is this object. So I'm going to show you how that's reconstructed in a little while. So if we look at this photo here. This is standing, the guy in the blue Galabea here is standing inside the burial chamber, the corner, and we're looking back towards the chapel. And you can see, therefore, you can see the fragments of broken limestone up on the flat surface then, but you can also see this other object, which we're going to look at in more detail in a second. When we look in the other direction, now you get a better idea. You're looking towards the burial chamber, and you can see the man in the blue Galabea there, but look inside the burial chamber, and you can see there's only about 3 largest pieces of limestone left, and there's nothing else in there. So apart from the fragments of stone that were brought out of there, there was no coffin, there was no mummy beads, there was no gold, there wasn't even a skeleton, no bones, no pottery. Now, so what happens is, if you look at this dark square here, what happened was that at some point in the ancient history, somebody came into that chapel and dug a tunnel from behind the chapel into the burial chamber. That's what the dark shadow is, you can see there. And they took everything out of the burial chamber, even the bones. Now, people say, oh, well, it's tomb robbery. No. Nobody bothers to take the bones out of a tomb when they're robbing it. They just leave the bones there. But there's no skeleton of a man or a woman or a family inside this burial chamber. The coffin was removed out of that tunnel and taken somewhere. And that, of course, is very reminiscent of the story of Joseph, who at the Exodus, when he dies, he asks his brethren to make sure that he is taken into the promised land when they leave Egypt. And, of course, he's buried at Shechem. So this story matches the idea of Moses coming along at the on the day of Exodus and removing the body of Joseph in his coffin out of the tomb, taking it with them on that journey, a 40-year journey to the promised land, where he's reburied at Shechem. And what you have here is an empty tomb that matches that story. So let's just look at those fragments of what was in front of the tunnel there, and reconstructed, they show you quite clearly a head and shoulders of a large statue about twice life size of a seated figure. So it's about 8 foot, 9 foot tall altogether. And you can see the head has been smashed. The whole face has been smashed off. Somebody has treated this and molested this statue. You can see the eyes have been gouged out. And then on the top of the head, you can see somebody's actually tried to hit the head with an axe and tried to smash it in two. And of course, the head was then detached from the shoulders, which you see there, and the rest of the statue has disappeared. It was probably big enough to be able to reuse somewhere as a block of stone, because it was roughly stone, block shaped. But what was left in the tunnel is a mutilated statue. Now, when we look at the thing in detail, it's actually remains of paint on it. First of all, the hair is beautifully combed. As you can see, it's a beautifully carved statue. But look at the fragments of red paint you can see just in the center of the picture there. And the holes where the axe has been attempted to strike the thing and try and break it in half. And look at the forehead, and you can see the forehead has got yellow paint. So this statue was a red-headed Semite with yellow skin, not the brown skin of the Egyptians. That's the way you portray Egyptians. So he was a light colored skin with red hair. And if we look further now, on the shoulder, he has a throw stick, like as a scepter of office. Now, this is the symbol in hieroglyphics for an Asiatic or a Semite. So it shows you that he's a Semitic official living in a palace in Goshen, who is responsible for that region, and he has authority through his palace and through the fact he has this scepter of office. And he is therefore an Asiatic or Semitic official working for the pharaoh, a very important one, because he has a pyramid tomb, which is very, very exceptional in this period. When we look at the back shoulder of the statue, amazingly, if you look very, very hard at that shoulder, you can see stripes of red and black, and white has faded away. But if I just help you out a little bit with that, this guy is wearing a coat of many colors. So he fits the bill to a T of what Joseph would have been like, and what his role was in history, in biblical history, and also in archaeological history. This is the reconstruction of the statue we have with these titles down the front. I'm out of this now.
Briefly, before we jump into the slavery aspect, I do just want to ask.
I'm going to let me just unshare quickly so I can.
Sorry.
There you go.
So just to ask, because there's a couple interesting questions to bring up. First one, you mentioned his title. Now, astute biblical students will actually remember that title, but maybe not every Christian would. It is kind of just offshoot referenced one time in the book of Genesis.
Yeah.
And much like Shishak, it is kind of a transliteration and not a straight up what the words are, right?
Right, correct. In the Bible, it says Zaphanath Pa'anea. That's the name is given. Okay, but when we translate that into Egyptian, the way we understand it, first of all, we have to have a little bit of metathesis because two of the continents have switched round. That quite happens with foreign names that are in a new language. For instance, somebody from the Caribbean would say, "Ask me something," not "asks me something." And so you get these little twists and turns when you get foreign words being used. So here's the Hebrew Bible trying to write what the Egyptian was. So they say Zaphanath, okay, but Egyptian is Zatanath. Now Zatanath, where the T and the F has been switched round, Zatanath means he who is called in Egyptian. Okay, now that is something we see in papyri of the period where we have Egyptian slaves who are Israelite slaves who are named Zatanaf something or other, he who is called, and then the Egyptian name, because they got given Egyptian names, just like, for instance, African slaves in America were given English names. They didn't retain their original African names by their owners, who actually owned them. So the same thing happened in Egypt. So Zatanaf or Zaphanath just simply means he who is called. So his real name, his Egyptian name that was given to him by Pharaoh, and remember that Pharaoh brought Jacob in, and Jacob discovered that his son was not dead because he thought Joseph had been killed by a lion or a beast. And he discovered when he arrived there that Joseph was alive. So Pharaoh said, right, I'm going to give Joseph a great name for his father. And he called him Anku. Or in actual Egyptian, that Anku is Egypto speak. The real name would have been pronounced Aneach. And Pa'aneach or Apaneach means the one who lives. So Joseph is called, he was called the one who lives. And that's because his father found him alive in Egypt when he thought he was dead. So it's a very appropriate name for him. So we refer to him in Egyptology as Anku, and he was the greatest vizier of the Middle Kingdom. He ruled for a whole period of time, running the country for the pharaoh from the end of the 12th dynasty all the way through to the middle of the 13th dynasty when he died. And at that point, then, the Israelites or the Semites of Avaris were enslaved when all the sons of Jacob had died. And that's the slavery period before we get the Exodus of Moses.
And just to go back on that point so that people don't miss that, you actually do believe that this figure who we know in Egyptology as Enku is the self-same person as Zaphanath Paneah on the basis that Ea and Enku are actually the same word, right?
Yes, absolutely. It could almost be that originally the name was Ishbi Anku because we got that Pa'anea or Apanea. Okay. Now, if it's Ishbi Anku, that Ishbi is the Egyptian name for Joseph. Shishak. Okay, so it would be Joseph lives. You could even go that far as to say the name means Joseph lives. But it's difficult to say whether Apanea, Apa, is Ishpa or not, because obviously the shin is missing there. But Pa is also a definite article, so it could just mean the one who lives. So the. Pa is the in Egyptian. So we have various, but we can be pretty sure that Anku is the vizier who saved Egypt from the famine. And not only that, but we find documents in Egypt naming the granaries after him because they're called the granaries of Anku. And we know that Joseph built granaries to store the seed over the first 7 years of plenty before the famine struck. So we even have archaeological evidence and textual evidence to show that Joseph or Anku was responsible for building granaries to store the grain during the famine period.
Now, the interesting thing, virtually everything that we've talked about so far is actually accepted by a majority of your opponents. So the big exception...
Well, let's qualify. Majority of my opponents who accept a 1446 BC Exodus, not those who support a Ramses Exodus. They would not agree with any of this.
Right. And thank you for the clarification there, because that's actually, that is a very important one to make. I don't know if they would go as far as to make the Enku connection. I think that one is probably not something Brantwood, Douglas Petrovich, and them would share, but they do appear to have most of this in line with what you're saying. Now, one thing that I think might immediately come up with one of them, though, is that a lot of people do tend to believe that Joseph's kin-like relationship to the Hyksos would make sense for him to reign during their time. Now, of course, we'll talk about the Hyksos probably a little bit later because you place them in a different and I think much more reasonable place.
Sure.
But that is, I think, a fair point to make. So, what would your personal response be to that kind of a link there?
Well, if you want to place Joseph and the Israelites' arrival in the Hyksos period, that's conventional chronology. In other words, if you don't revise the timeline at all, and you have Ramses II as the pharaoh of the Exodus, you can move back to the time of Joseph and place him in the Hyksos period. Now, the Hyksos kings were Asiatics; they were from the north; they were Semites themselves. So the idea it's an attractive idea that maybe the pharaoh who did not know Joseph was actually not an Egyptian. He was an Asiatic from the north, Western Asiatic. But that isn't the case, really, because we know, for instance, that Moses was dealing with an Egyptian king. We know that Joseph was dealing with an Egyptian king. And there's no reason to imagine that it has to be a foreign king who does not know Joseph, because we have documents towards the middle of the 13th dynasty, which actually list Hebrew slaves. So we know that in that period, before the Hyksos arrived, there were slaves, Semitic slaves in Egypt, sometime between the end of Anku's period in office when he died and the Exodus, which is at the end of the 13th dynasty. We have a slave list to prove that that is the case.
And we actually have not just Semitic names, but even names straight out of the Bible, right? Like Jacob, for example.
Yeah, and one of the midwives of the story of the killing of the children, the male children, she's in there as well, or at least somebody with the same name as her. And we have two tribal names, Asher and Manasseh, are also in there. So there are many people called after Anku as well. So they named their children after the famous vizier. So we have a whole bunch of these Semites who have got this Jeduaneth or the Zaphanat name, he who is called, and then their Egyptian names. So we know that we have these names in there, and they are very, very similar to, many of them are very similar to what we find in the story of the sojourn and the slavery period.
And for me personally, I'll just say that is one of the more convincing elements, not just that there are the Semitic names, but also that they share what is an Egyptian term, Zaphanat, right? Because it would seem to me if there were Hyksos pharaohs who were ruling contemporary with Joseph, then they would have a different name for that. Or if there were Hyksos pharaohs who were the ones who did not know Joseph, potentially there could be also something where they mention the differentiation there, using a different language, different practices, something like that. But that's missing from the Bible.
I think it is. And crucially, when you look further, when you look into the period of the conquest, we have an Anakim, one of the great lords who were the ones who fought against the conquest. We have one of them there who is called Shishak or Sheshai. Now, he is actually one of the first Hyksos kings to turn up in Egypt before the greater Hyksos. So you have to have the Exodus 40 years before that, otherwise that doesn't work, because obviously Joshua was a contemporary of this Sheshai, and Sheshai was a contemporary of the conquest, and therefore it must be 40 years after the Exodus took place, and he's one of the first kings of the early Hyksos period, so the Exodus must have taken place before the Hyksos.
Absolutely. And so that would bring us then to one brief question. And although this question is a little bit more speculative, it is something that's still fun. Do we have a good, solid candidate for the pharaoh that Joseph interpreted dreams for?
Yes, we do, of course. His name, who will not be familiar to most people, is Amenemhat III. Okay, so he's one of the latest kings of the 12th dynasty, and he's one of the most powerful kings of the dynasty. He reigned for a good 40-odd years. So he was very powerful. We have remarkable statues of him and his father, who was also a co-regent. So when Senusret III introduced his son as a co-regent king, Senusret still ruled for another 20-odd years. So there was a 20-year co-regency period, in which time Joseph would have arrived in Egypt. And both of them, both Senusret in his later years and Amenemhat in his younger years, they have statues made of them, showing them very careworn, like they are worried. They have worry lines. They have sunken eyes. They have turned out ears. They look like they are suffering. And that is representational of the suffering of the people. Every other time in Egyptian history, they're all smiley pharaohs. You don't see anything like that at all. But in this one period, we see these remorseful kings in their imagery. And what it is showing empathy towards the people who are suffering during the famine. So we know there was a pretty huge famine at that period of time, which would be consistent with the story of Joseph's famine and Jacob arriving in the second year of the famine.
And then another just very brief question on that. Is there by chance any evidence of this famine outside of Egypt? Like, is it possible that we may have actually found Canaanites wanting to, like, for example, the story of Jacob's sons, right? They want to go down to Egypt to buy food.
Yeah, I just lost you for a minute. Do you want to repeat that question?
Yeah, my apologies. So in the Bible, we see that the famine spreads to Canaan, right? And Jacob sends his sons down to Egypt, which of course is the catalyst for the reunification. Do we by chance have any evidence of other cultures fleeing to Egypt to get grain at this time?
Not really, because the people who moved down there are the Israelites. That's our story. That's the one we know about. What we can understand is the mechanism, though, because people have asked this question before. If there was a famine in Egypt, why does that mean there was a famine in Canaan? And that's a very good question to ask. And what it is basically this. If you can imagine the way we look at our climate zones today, you have the Gulf Stream and you have the movement of the patterns of wind in the upper atmosphere. They move all the time. So for instance, we have shifts in the dynamics of the way the patterns work on our Earth. So if you imagine, for instance, that the tropical zones around the equator have moved northwards, that produces heavy rain in Ethiopia, in Abyssinia, in that area, and that causes very, very high Nile floods, which cause destruction in the River Nile. They flood the Nile, they wipe out the cattle, they destroy the houses, and of course what they do is the water remains on the Nile Valley, on the fields, well past the time of planting. The result of which is you don't get a harvest, because if the ground is sodden wet and 2 feet deep in water, you cannot plant your crops in it. You can't plow your fields. And the result of that is you end up with a famine. Now, if that happens year after year after year, you get a 7-year famine. You get a period when nobody has grain. And that's why Joseph stored the grain in the grain stores in the 7 years of plenty before that, so that those grain stores were moved up onto the desert plateau, so they weren't damaged by the floods. So that's the mechanism that causes the famine in Egypt. But if these climate zones are shifting northwards, then the Sahara zone and the Arabia zone are moving into the Canaan. So you end up with a dry climate in Canaan with no rain. So in Egypt, it's a flood resulting from excessive water from Ethiopia coming from the Blue Nile, and in Canaan, it's the result of the desert climate moving into Canaan, and so there's no rain for them to cultivate. They don't have a river like the Egyptians do, and that is the cause of the famine in Canaan. Whereas in Egypt, it's the cause of too much water.
All right, and thank you for that. That is obviously a key element here into the whole story. But I do want to jump in now because we've got a lot of solid information that'll lead us into slavery. So we know they're there. We have even, I would say, almost definitive evidence of Joseph himself. So then, do we have evidence that these people were enslaved, or potentially maybe even a new dynasty? And also on that note, what does it seem like, from the historical perspective, the Bible means by one who did not know Joseph?
Okay, so I need to go back onto the visuals, I think, to show you this. So I need to show you a papyrus, which is very important. So I'll go back to share again. Share screen, application window. It's quite a rigmarole, but it's worth it. And now if I go here, I want to close all these things. And I play, and let's just take a look at that. So the Pharaoh did not know Joseph. All right. Well, the first thing is I mentioned a papyrus, a slave list, didn't I, earlier on? And that is Papyrus Brooklyn 351446. And here you see some of the names. This is just a part of it. It's a very fragmentary. It's a large document. This is just one section. But we find the names, as I said earlier, Asher, Issachar. We have Jacob, Menachem, We have even Job in there, which is a good Hebrew name, and we have Shiphrah, of course, who was one of the midwives of the Israelites in the time of the killing of the firstborn. Sorry, not the firstborn, the male children of the Israelites. So this is our evidence where we have slavery appearing in Egypt for the first time of the Semites. Now, the king in whose time that document was recorded is called Sobek-Hotep the third. I can see there's a J in there that shouldn't be there. But Sobek-Hotep the third is the king that you can see on this fragment of papyrus here when the slavery is in full swing. Whether it happened a generation earlier or not is difficult to say, but we know in his time there were Semitic slaves in Egypt. Now, he was succeeded by Neferhotep I. Now, Neferhotep I, he was the time in which Moses was born, okay, as a baby. And then we have Sihator, who only reigned for about 6 months maximum, not really important. And then we have a king called Sobek-Hotep IV, and that is the period in which Moses is a prince of Egypt and where eventually he's exiled into Sinai. So this is the period that we're looking at in Egyptian history. We need to look a little bit more detail at that. So let's look at Moses now. Now, we do actually have a document, or it's not preserved, but it's referenced in numerous classical documents about the name of the king who actually was the one who raised Moses in the palace in Egypt. Now, the author of this is somebody called Artaparna. So he's a Jewish scholar, and he probably comes from, we think, either Iran or Turkey. His name sounds like it's possibly Iranian. And he gives the pharaoh who raised Moses in the palace, who obviously is the key to all this. In the conventional dating, it's Seti the First. You know, you can see the Sesame DeMille movie, but he gives him in Greek because he's writing in Greek for his Greek masters, the Ptolemies, for the Alexandrian library. He's writing the name there in Greek, and he's writing his narrative in Greek, and he calls him Kenofres. Now that is Greek, but if we transcribe that into Egyptian, it's Karnefere or Karnefara. Okay, Nefer is Nofra, probably in original Egyptian. Ka is K, and Re is the god Ra or Res, but in the Greek it's often written as Res. So we're looking for a guy called Karnefere. Okay, and there's only one king in the entire history of Egypt with that prenomen or coronation name, and that is Karnefere Sobek-Hotep IV. He's the only king in the entire history of Egypt with this prenomen. And I just showed you him on that fragment of papyrus, didn't I? He's the last one in that little fragment I showed you. So if we go and show you statues of him, he's really the most important king of the 13th dynasty, the most powerful one. Here are statues at Karnak of him. You can see if you go to Karnak. And he's the 24th ruler of the 13th dynasty. That's the guy in the time that Moses was a prince of Egypt. Now, if we look at the papyrus again, the bit we were looking at a minute ago is that bottom right-hand corner down there. But this is a little bit more of it expanded. As you can see, it's very fragmentary. It's called the Royal Canon of Turin. It's a long document going all the way through from the pre-dynastic age all the way through to the 19th dynasty. But this is the section we're interested in today because this is the time of the Israelites in Egypt. So let's look at where we are. Well, the 13th dynasty begins on the right-hand column here, column 6. The last part of the 12th dynasty is the last 3 lines of that document there. It's written in hieratic, by the way, not in hieroglyphs. And then the 13th dynasty kings all come down that column there. Now, they were very short-lived kings in this time. The time that Joseph was a vizier, the kings reigned for a very short period of time, some of them only 1 or 2 years. We don't know why that is. It's possibly something to do with the fact that they were not powerful enough, and that Joseph, in fact, was the real ruler of the country. He was the one dictating who should be the king of Egypt, because a lot of them seem to have been sacked or got rid of. Anyway, they come all the way down to the 24th king, and that is this guy, Sobek-Hotep IV Karnefere. He's the king in whose time Moses was an adult, a young adult, and he was probably in the military, and he probably campaigned down in Ethiopia or Kush at the time the Bible doesn't mention, but the Bible does mention the fact that he married a Cushite woman. And that's probably because Artaparnas tells us that he campaigned down there and he actually married a Cushite princess at the time when he defeated the Cushite king down there. But let's move on to where it goes from there. So if we go to the next column and we go down 40 years, because we have the reign lengths of the kings here, we right at the bottom of that arrow, there's a fragment of the name of a king. and that name is Dudimose. The part that's left is Mose, and he's the 34th king of the dynasty. And that's the first time we see in Egyptian history the name of Moses. So Mose in Egyptian is where we get Moshe from, or Moses from. So we know that name was in circulation at this time. And in fact, this king is actually named Dudimose. Okay, so part of the element, it means born of in Egyptian, but because it means raised out of the water in Hebrew, because it's a play on words. But if we then find a little bit of information about this particular, well, in fact, what we'll do is we'll pause there, because you've probably got a few questions to ask. Then we'll go to the Exodus itself. So let me come out of that, and I'll come back to sharing again, or dot sharing. So there's a lot to take in there, but we actually have the names of these kings. We know that Sobekotep III could be the king who did not know Joseph, because by this time Joseph died, all his brothers have died, and he is the guy we have a slave document from. It might have been a king slightly before him, that's possible, but we also know that Neferhotep I was the one in whose time Moses was born. And then we have Sobekotep, Karnephrite, in the time when Moses was exiled out of Egypt.
So, and a couple questions. So, all great stuff here for sure. So the first thing I want to, just as a comment for the audience, you mentioned this, and what was his name again? This Persian Jewish historian?
Artapanus.
Artapanus.
Artapanus, yeah. He's very well known in the classical world, but unfortunately his original manuscript doesn't survive. But we have quotations in Josephus and various other places.
And the interesting thing that I kind of find a little bit with that is, it's interesting. You don't tend to make identifications that the ancient world didn't already make, right? For example, we may find out later, Ptolemaios is what Josephus calls the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And you would call him Dudimose.
He calls him Ptolemaios, yes, Greek version of Dudimose, correct. Yeah, that's the way, but that's the information we've got to work with. These classical historians, the people who wrote the big books in the Alexandrian Library, they are our best source for this material. That and the archaeology and the Bible. Those are the three sources we've got. And of course, Egyptian texts, which then corroborate all these other incidents we find out in the story of the Sojourn and Exodus and Conquest.
See, and I think that's a huge portion of solid evidence for this theory, because when you look at, like, for example, Ramses, right? There is no record of Ramses being the Pharaoh of the Exodus, not in the Bible, not outside of the Bible. It exists in the modern world, right?
Yeah,
and on the
exactly. Well, on the basis simply of the building the city of Ramses in Exodus 1.
Right. Exactly. And I like that a lot. I like that your work takes the ancient historian seriously, because I have always been one who I'm somewhat zealous for our ancestors' history. I don't like that they dismiss Josephus and Eusebius and Herodotus as if they were morons, because they weren't. Right.
Well, no, Herodotus is called the father of lies by most modern Egyptologists.
Right.
But the thing is, the reason why there's so much doubt about these writers is because they've got the wrong timeline today. And so when they look at the history, it doesn't fit together with the archaeology because the timeline is wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that I could just repeat myself, I guess, but I just think it's such a strong piece of evidence for this. But to go a little further and to ask some other questions we have there. So, that I have, I guess, because obviously I'm not reading off the questions for the audience quite.
Right.
So what seemingly, at least, is the best explanation for, I know we were mentioning, right, this Pharaoh does reign after Joseph and all of his brethren are dead. Is there some kind of a dynasty shift or something that might indicate why he's so hostile to the Hebrews?
That's a very good question too. Because I told you about these 30 dynasty kings all having short reigns and not being very important. When we come to Sobekotep III, he's a brand new sub-dynasty within the 13th. They come from Thebes, they come from Upper Egypt, and they are completely different to the ones who went before them. They're a new family. And as you say, Joseph's gone, his brothers have gone, and these guys are from the south, and they say, hang on a minute, we're now in charge of the whole country. What are these guys up in the north doing, these Western Asiatics, these Semites, who've been running the country and messing us about with all these small minor rulers? We're now going to take charge. And so they are much more powerful than the ones who went before them. And they have this like sub-dynasty of power, which enslaves the Israelites, and that results in Moses and the Exodus coming within their sub-dynasty.
And then
much better than the Hyksos, I must say.
Yeah, well, and you know, it is interesting because there are things I don't think that I think the 1250 date is the worst. The 1450 date on conventional chronology, I don't find them to be absurd, even though I do find them to be wrong. But there is every now and then something like the Hyksos thing. You know, it's like I can see that it's a palatable idea. It's just when you get somebody like yourself who's able to, like, you know, actually been studying Egyptology for decades at this point, right?
Yeah.
You can start to see what some of the problems actually are, where somebody like myself, who's more of a layman, might not actually initially see them.
Well, it might be important then just to cover a little bit about the mid-18th dynasty Exodus so we can see where the weaknesses are in it. I think that's very important to do that because, as you say, a lot of evangelical Christian scholars go for that 1446 BC date without a revision of the chronology. So they they end up in the reign of Imhotep II as the of the Exodus. Well, you know, as far as I'm concerned, nothing happened disastrous in his reign at all. And in fact, a really crucial bit of biblical evidence is when you go to the book of Deuteronomy, and when Moses is recapping the story of the Exodus, and he goes through the whole thing again to the people before he goes up to Mount Nebo and dies, he refers to the fact that Egypt is still destroyed at the time that they are sitting just before they attack Jericho, 40 years after the Exodus. He refers to the Egyptians as still being oppressed. Now, that is not possible in the reign of Amenhotep III, who comes 40 years after Amenhotep II. He is the richest, the wealthiest, the most prestigious king of the dynasty. There's superb wealth in Egypt and power in that period. The land is full of peace. There are no wars. That's not what Moses is referring to 40 years later when he's just on the east side of the Jordan River about to cross over to attack Jericho. There is no destruction of Egypt lasting that long except in the Hyksos period. In other words, at the end of the 13th dynasty, Egypt is on its knees for 100 plus years while the Hyksos come in and invade and sack the place and kill the kings and take the women and enslave them all. So that's the oppression of Egypt that Moses is referring to, and it only works in the Hyksos period. It does not work in the mid-18th dynasty.
And something that I would want to add to that too and get to see what you want to comment on is even almost worse than that, seemingly to me at least, is the Judges period. Because in the 18th and 19th dynasties, there seems to be almost annual campaigns into Canaan, and yet Judges has no reference to Egypt and Canaan whatsoever.
No, that's interesting because you've got to realize what's happening in the Judges period. The tribes are up in the hill country. They are not in the lowlands, okay? They have not conquered the Philistine cities down there. They have not conquered Megiddo. They are not where the Via Maris is, which is the campaign route of the Egyptian armies going up to fight in the north against Mitanni. The Mitanni is up in the Habiru region, up in the north, Mesopotamia. So there is no reason for the Egyptians to go into the hill country where a bunch of tribes are and hardly any cities of significance, just Shechem and Hebron. And they are, at this time, they're not all that significant. Jerusalem was just a small outpost at this time run by the Jebusites. Okay, so there was no reason to go there, and there's no reason for the tribes to come and attack the Egyptians down on the coastal plain. So you wouldn't expect them. There are two different universes at that period of time during the 18th dynasty. So the Judges period fits beautifully in the 18th dynasty. That's where it sits, where you would expect that to happen. So Thutmose III, the great Napoleon of ancient Egypt, was campaigning all the way up into the north. He wasn't campaigning in the hill country of Canaan. He didn't want to know about that. There was nothing there for him. There were just tribes living in tents. There was nothing else going on until the first kings came along. And Saul was the first one to start causing trouble for Egypt when he started attacking the Philistines on the lowlands. And that's when David comes along and Solomon comes along. But then we're through the 18th dynasty and we're at the beginning of the 19th dynasty.
All right. And I do have a couple questions on that, but I'm going to save those just because that's a topic that'll come up a little bit later as far as Saul. Okay. Well, maybe it might, I guess we are Potentially going to run out of time before then because it's a little bit farther down the road in the chronology. But nonetheless,
we can always we could do another interview another time about that if you want. No problems.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, by the way, because I am very much enjoying this and would absolutely like a. I mean, there's so much information that you almost would have to ask for a part 2, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So I'll hold back some of my questions then and get straight into the next portion, which I think now that we've got solid evidence of slavery of Semites in Egypt by natural-born pharaohs, or native-born, sorry, not natural, native-born pharaohs. The next question then becomes a exodus, and we probably wouldn't expect to find evidence of an exodus per se, although we might find people who are not in the region anymore, but more of a destruction of Egypt. So first off, if I'm wrong in my assumption, please correct it. And then secondly, do we have that evidence?
Yes, we do. Now, I'm going to ask you to do your little promo now so I can pop up to the loo, to what we call the loo in England, which is the bathroom for you, or the restroom. I'll go and do that. You give them your little spiel about the next thing, and then we'll start on the Exodus. We've got a lot of material to talk about there. So give me 2 minutes, and I'll be back in 2. All right?
Absolutely.
All right, then. See you in a minute.
Yes, sir. And so while we are waiting here, I do want to firstly acknowledge some of the chat. I do see you guys. All of your questions are being recorded and will be asked towards the end. So I just want to let you guys all know about that. Want to briefly acknowledge some of you guys by name. Obviously, I know a lot of you guys are frequent fans, so I appreciate you. SJ, thank you for being here. Appreciate seeing you today. Brother Nicholas, I see you here as well. Thank you very much for being here. Jamie Russell, I see here. I appreciate you being here. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce your name, Kelvy. I'm not going to say the second part of it because I know I'll mispronounce it, but I appreciate you being here. Also, Richard Neal, blessed be he. A couple other guys here, Reverend Gary Crawford. I appreciate, again, all you guys being here. And if you guys have questions, do throw them into the live chat. They are being recorded in my notepad, and we'll ask here afterwards. I want to briefly recap what we've actually talked about so far, just so you guys who may be showing up a little bit late might get a general idea of what we've covered so far. Do watch all of this because there's a lot of great information here. So if you haven't watched the whole thing, if you're coming in late, definitely go back to the beginning. This is one of the better episodes we've had here. But nonetheless, what we've discussed so far, we started discussing why chronologies can be as fickle as they are, because they're inherently self-referential unless you have a synchronism, and that synchronism is correct. We then explained why the synchronism used to establish Egyptian chronology, namely the Shishak connection, is not correct, but rather Shishak probably it can be better attributed to a figure known as Shishak, who we know as Ramses II, right? Famously the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and a lot of popular depictions like the Prince of Egypt, the Ten Commandments, so on and so forth, right? And then after that, once we freed ourselves from that particular chronological understanding, we then looked back at where there would be a better link, right? Where we would have a better idea of Israel being in Egypt, right? And then through that, we looked at the fact that there were Semites in the Goshen region, looked at the fact that we had these Semites becoming incredibly powerful, even a tomb of Joseph. And then we saw that these people were eventually enslaved, seeing even explicitly biblical Hebrew names mentioned in the slave list, and getting as good as now, even having names, right? Names for Pharaoh of the oppression, names for Pharaoh who raised Moses, name for the Pharaoh who Joseph may have spoken to, and even potentially a name for Joseph himself, which again may be Enku. So a lot of great information that we've been able to cover here so far. And again, if you haven't seen the whole thing, if you're just coming in, definitely start at the beginning. Lot of solid information here, and it's you won't want to miss any of it. Honestly, I think it's an hour and a half, and each minute is useful.
I'm back.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So we are now returning to our interview here, and what we're going to jump into now is the Exodus itself, having already established that there is solid evidence for the enslavement.
Okay.
Real quick, though, actually, very briefly, I did want to ask, because I know it is something that you've noted in your work, and so it's important, I guess, for the audience to know. The slaughter of the innocents that causes Moses to actually be in Pharaoh's house in the first place. We have found evidence of that, right?
Yes, it's a difficult one because it's anthropological evidence as opposed to archaeological. What we find is sometime in the 13th dynasty, we're not exactly sure where it is because the reports don't separate the timeline. They don't tell us which part of the burial sequence is specifically in the 13th dynasty or a particular time. But we find there's a massive increase in the burials of infants at Tel Daba, which is the archaeological name, the name of the place for Avaris, the city of Avaris. So there are normally in a typical cemetery that you find in the ancient world throughout history, you probably find around 25% of the bodies buried in a cemetery are going to be infants. So that defined by them being up to 1 year old, or a little bit over 1 year old, perhaps. In Tel Daba, in Avaris, in this period, we find that increases to more than 50%. Now, that is a major issue because why are so many infants being buried at this time? And it's difficult to pinpoint a historical event. But if we look at the biblical event, we do have this story of the culling of the male infants. And of course, Moses himself is under threat to be killed for the same reason, which is why he's hidden in the basket and then Pharaoh's daughter finds him in the Nile. So we do have this instance there of the killing, the culling of infant boys. Now, it's interesting because then when we analyze the adult population of burials that are left, in other words, the people who are survived to adulthood, and we look at the sexes of those, because infants, you can't tell the sex. You can tell the sex of adults by their hip sizes, etc. So when we analyze those, we find that there are 3 females to every 2 males, which means there's a skew in the population. A typical population is roughly 50-50. But in this case, there are more females than there are males. And that might be explained by the fact that we have more male infant burials than we do female infant burials, which would then match the story that we find in the Bible of the killing of the Israelite boys, children. So there is some archaeological evidence, but it is interpretive. I mean, we don't have a text which specifically says Pharaoh ordered the midwives or to smother the children, or the soldiers to kill the children, or whatever it might be. But we do have this strange skew in the burial pattern at Avaris, which would be consistent with the story that we find in the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you allowing me to just take that back a little bit because I did miss that earlier.
Not a problem.
But now that we got that, so now let's get to the evidence for the Exodus itself.
Okay, now I'll do very briefly just some evidence for the 10th plague, which I think is very important, and the abandonment of the city of Avaris, which again is very important because the Israelites leave on a single day and disappear from the face of the earth as far as the Egyptians are concerned. And then I'll go on, if it's all right with you, I'll go on to what we believe to be the place of the miracle of the sea. This doesn't require revised chronology. This is something that conventional Egyptologists will mainly argue or interested in the subject. There's many like James Hoffmeyer who will agree with this, Manfred Betak and others who will say the toponyms that we know of the story of the Bible of them coming to the Yam Suf, the Reed Sea. Some people call it the Red Sea. The Septuagint calls it the Red Sea. But we have toponyms, names associated with that particular event, which are on the eastern border of Egypt. And they're not in Sinai, and they're not in Saudi Arabia. They're not in what people call Midian. They are actually on the border of Egypt. So I'd like to go through that a little bit, if that's all right with you.
Absolutely.
And then we'll come back and talk about it. So again, back to sharing. Let's see if we can get this right. So far, so good with the sharing. It seems to be working.
Yeah, it does tend to be working pretty well so far.
So let's
also, just so you know, the audience is absolutely eating up. Not only what we're talking about, but the slides in particular. They're definitely finding it very useful.
Well, it does help. It does help to have visuals. And of course, these are typical of what I do in my lectures. So if anybody wants to hire me to come and lecture for them, I'm very happy to do that. So let's just go through this then. So the journey to the Reed Sea. I don't seem to have anything about the. Let me just go back a minute. I don't think I've got the. Did I do the? What happened to the burials? I don't see the burials here, so I'm a bit worried about where they've gone. I'll see what comes up. I don't actually remember. I'll just move this forward a little bit, get out of all this, and get back to where we were. Sorry, I have to go through each step of it. The 10th plague. It does say the 10th plague, but I don't see it. But anyway, we'll see what happens. This says to the Reed Sea, so I may have missed it, but we'll see. We can talk about that otherwise in a minute. So the journey, once they leave the land of Goshen, they obviously go to this place the Bible refers to as Yam Suf. But of course, the Septuagint, that's the Masoretic version, the Septuagint refers to it as the Red Sea. That may be a mistranslation. We'll talk about that a little bit later, perhaps. So they go from Goshen to a place called Sukkoth. That is Tel El Maskuta in the Wadi Chumalat in Egypt. It's biblical Sukkot, which means, of course, temporary booths, which and Tel El Maskuta was actually a campsite. So that seems to match very well. And they went to Etham. And from Etham, they turn back. God tells them to turn back from Etham, and they arrive at a place called Pi-Hahiroth, and that is where the Yam Suf is located, or the Sea of Reeds, as we translate it. So let's look at that Yam Suf expression. The Israelites did not cross the Red Sea; they crossed the Reed Sea, Hebrew Yam Suf, or Sea of Reeds. Now we have an Egyptian name which is equivalent to that. The Egyptians called it Pachuf, the Reeds. Now, a Semitic S, Samek, okay, turns into an Egyptian Ch. So Pachuf is the same as Suf, the Suf, okay, it's the word for reeds. It's actually a borrowed word. It's a Hebrew word, which is borrowed by the Egyptians. We know where that is. That place has actually been located. So in Exodus 14, 1-2, Yah spoke to Moses and said, tell the Israelites to turn back and pitch camp in front of Pi-Hahiroth. This is the location of the campsite, between Migdol and the sea. Now notice there are two seas here, between Migdol and the sea, to the east of Baal-Zephon. Now Baal-Zephon is a place we know where that's located. We know also where Migdol is located. You must pitch your camp opposite the place, Pi-Hahiroth, beside the sea. Now that sea is important. Is that the Yam Suf, or is that a different sea? In Numbers 33:7, they left Etham, turned back to Pi-Hahiroth to the east of Baal-Zephon. So we have two versions of that same story. They're connected to the fact that the place, the campsite, is to the east of Baal-Zephon. Now let's look at Pi-Hahiroth. What does that mean? Well, in Hebrew, we break it down into three words. The word P is the word for mouth in Semitic. Ha is just a definite article, the. And then Hiroth is a very interesting name. It's something that we see in lots of different ancient texts. It's actually a word for canal. Now, we have various examples of that. For instance, in Akkadian, which is an East Semitic language, it's called Pi-Hiriti, the mouth of the canal. In Northwest Semitic, which is the same as Hebrew, but this is Ugaritic, it's called Chara, which is the word for canal. And Papyrus Anastasi, which is an Egyptian text, refers to it as a Semitic name, Parchara, the canal. So we know that Hiroth is almost certainly either a singular or plural version of the word canals. It could be canal or canals. It's difficult to say, but it has a plural ending in Hebrew. So it probably means mouth of the canals, but we'll see. We're looking for something like this on an Egyptian relief here of Seti I in Karnak, where we have a border canal. This border canal is full of crocodiles, and you can see the reeds on either side. They flatten them out because they don't have perspective on Egyptian reliefs, but you've got reeds on either side of the canal running vertically through the middle of the scene here. You have crocodiles inside, and you have a fortress on either side. And on the left-hand side, we have the Egyptian king coming along in triumph, herding a load of captives, Shasu Bedouins, across into Egypt. On the right-hand side of the canal, we have the Egyptians celebrating the return of the king with all the captives that he's brought with him. So we know that there is a border canal that they have to cross to get out of Egypt. Now, this is a spy satellite photograph from the 1960s, I think, 1970s. And this is what the coastline looked like not like it is today, but like it was in ancient times. And this infrared version shows you that the coastline is very different to modern coastline today. So that dark triangle you see at the top of the page there is actually open sea. That's the Mediterranean, whereas today it's just mudflats. And so it's been silted up since then. But let me just superimpose on all the sites that we have found in this area. Now, Tel Dafana is very important because that's Baal Zephon. And the site T78, it has different names, but it's on the right-hand side there, is actually one of the sites that candidates for Migdol. Tel Achmar is roughly where a canal used to flow from the original lake there out into the desert to an oasis. So that was an artificial canal that was created there. And Tel Abu Sefah, Sefah is modern Arabic for Suf. So it means that Tel Pa Suf. Abu is Arabic for Pa, the Egyptian definite article. So it means the mound of Parsuf, or Parchuf, which is, of course, the reeds. Now, we superimpose what the coastline looked like with the Mediterranean Sea. And now you can see there's a large lake, which we've identified, scholars have identified at the bottom there, called Parchufi or Parchuf, which is the Sea of Reeds of the Bible. And that canal I mentioned to you opens out from that lake towards that oasis to the right-hand side there, and that is where the mouth of the canal is. In other words, Pi Ha-Hiroth is located opposite where that canal flows from the lake towards the oasis. Baal Zephon is Tel Dafana on the western side there, so Pi Ha-Hiroth is to the east of Baal Zephon. And Migdol, which is at the end of this lagoon here called Par-Shihor by the Egyptians, Migdol is actually to the east side of Par-Haroth. So all the places are there in this location. And that is the Egyptian name Par-Chara, the name of the canal, which is the Hebrew Kiroth. So this is what the topography looked like at the time of the Exodus. And you can see the dotted line there, the red one, is where the Israelites came up to camp. And you can see they are trapped on three sides by water and swamp regions. The only way they could get out of there is to return back to the west. But that's where the Egyptians are coming in their chariots. So they had no way to escape. The only way they could escape is to cross the Parchuf, or the Sea of Reeds. And that is opposite Par-Hiroth. And then they're in the Sinai desert and they can journey on their way for 40 years. Here is that an aerial photograph of that canal as it is today. The remains of it, it's dried up, as you can see, running into Sinai. So it is a major, major feature in the region. And there you can see it running past Migdol. And you can see that Migdol now becomes a sort of border post where if you're coming into Egypt, you're funneled between Par-Shihor, the lake, and the canal towards Migdol, and you have to go through a passport section where you have to get into the country. So emigration point, if you like. But to the west of that is the location of where the Israelites crossed this Sea of Reeds. Now, look at the locations. The Bible describes it exactly like this. Pi Ha-Hiroth is between Migdol and the sea. In this case, the sea is actually the Mediterranean. And it is to the east of Baal Zephon. So all the toponyms are there according to the biblical text. Now, when we send a strong east wind, which is what God did to blow back the waters to part them, it comes across the Sinai and it blows the waters back of this Reed Sea. And I'm going to show you how a future reconstruction works of this. This is something which is done by brilliant scientists over in America, where they've modeled with computer modeling something called wind set down in this region. Now, wind set down is a phenomenon whereby a strong wind can part waters up to, say, 2 to 3 meters deep, so that it can push it to the left and to the right if it's coming from the east. Now, what I want you to watch is the central area of this chart, because I'm going to run you several frames of this to show you what happens during a period of nighttime when you apply a strong east wind coming from the right towards the left and parting the waters. And don't forget that the area where you see the light blue is the area where the event takes place of the crossing of the Reed Sea. So let's run this program. So we're going to set a 62 mile per hour east wind, which is about 100 kilometers per hour. That's the sort of thing you have quite a lot in America, in the South. Those sort of winds you can stand up in, but they're still very strong. But they're not, they're not impossibly strong. They're sufficient. That's why we chose a speed like that. It's something that you could walk. If there was a strong east wind, you could walk into it, which of course the Israelites had to do to cross the sea. So let's move it on now. So, and don't forget also that on the other side there is the desert of Shur. The desert of Shur is where the Israelites end up when they cross this, and that is a known location in northwest Sinai. It is not in Midian. It is not in Saudi Arabia. It's in this location. So let's now run this program. Let's start at 7 p.m. And at 7 p.m., it's starting to get dark. The Egyptians have come up that land bridge there, and they're blocking the exit of the Israelites. So they have to cross to the southeast across the water. And so at 7 p.m., the waters are still exactly as they were. Nothing's happened. Then the wind starts. Okay, and the wind starts to blow it. By 10 p.m., you can see that the wind has blown back the waters on two sides. So that if you're standing on that land bridge there, you can now cross on dry land, across onto the desert side, while the Egyptians are still waiting further to the southwest. At 3 a.m., the waters have parted to their maximum distance. So by this time, the whole group, congregation of Israelites would have been able to cross, or are in the process of crossing, towards the desert side from the Pi HaKeroth, the camp opposite the mouth of the canal, which you can see there. But at 8 a.m., when the Egyptians start to travel across the dry land, the water is suddenly returning again because the wind has died down. At this point, the flood waters are coming back, and within 6 minutes, the Egyptian army is drowned. Because in 6 minutes, those two walls of water come crashing back at a much higher altitude or depth than the original water was, because they're coming back like a bore now, a tidal wave. And they're coming back on both sides, and they're hitting each side. They're coming crashing into each other, and they're destroying the chariots. The bodies of the horses are hitting the humans, the soldiers. The chariots are disintegrating, and they're drowning and being destroyed in the waters. It does not have to be Cecil B. DeMille style, hundreds of feet deep, to do this. This sort of thing can happen in relatively shallow waters. This is the real miracle of the sea, and it's what science produces to show us how it happened.
So one question that I know would immediately come up from some of the audience, just real quick, is because the Bible tends to describe, and this is where I think you get most of the imagery from, like Prince of Egypt and Ten Commandments, the idea of walls of water on either side. Yes. Now, to be fair, it doesn't say anything as specific as, like, the Prince of Egypt scene where they see a whale in the wall, right? It doesn't say anything that specific, but
look at the translation. It's actually it is as waters to them. As walls to them. So the waters part, and they become as walls to them. What that means is they become a barrier. In other words, there are two walls on either side. It doesn't say how high they are. It doesn't say they're massively deep at all. It just says they're a barrier, and they cross on dry land between the two walls. That is what the wind set now shows us. It does not say to a huge depth. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that these are massively high walls of water, anywhere. Okay, so even later on, we get the references in Psalms, etc. We hear about the Israelites the Egyptians being killed in the depth of the water. That doesn't say how deep it is. It could be 5 meters, 10 meters. It doesn't have to be hundreds of meters at all. That's Cecil B. DeMille that's invented that. And ever since then, everybody's followed it, and that's what they see in their heads when they see the crossing of the Red Sea. But it's not what the Bible actually says. So you've got to be careful. You've got to look at the actual translation to see where it's referenced. And you will not see anywhere in the Bible where it says it was a great deep sea. Nowhere does it say that.
And then the second question that certain would ask, probably not everybody, but a little bit of the more astute ones. The common theory that is usually thrown around as to why Reed Sea and Red Sea got mixed up is that it's a mix-up in English, but not in Hebrew. In other words, Yom Suf doesn't sound like Yom Adon necessarily, but Reed Sea and Red Sea sound similar, and that it was an English mix-up of the same body of water. Now, you would probably disagree with that, right?
It's a little bit more complicated than that. The first thing is that the word yam does not necessarily mean a sea. For instance, the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea are both yams, but they're not regarded as seas. They're regarded as lakes. Okay, so it's a large body of water. It doesn't actually mean sea. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that ancient Hebrew was written only with consonants. There were no vowels written. Okay, later on we actually get the vowel markers come in later in the text. But as the early texts were written, that there would have been written just SF, the word suf. Yeah. So we read it as suf for reeds because we have the same word used when we talk about the material that the Moses basket was made out of, sufim. That's reeds, okay? But the Red Sea may well be Yam Sof, which means the sea of the end. So it may simply be a case that the two have been confused because we only have the consonant values and not the vowel values. So the Reed Sea is different to the sea of the end. Okay, and that was the difference between suf and sof. It's a very, very subtle thing, but that might be an explanation as to why we get that. And incidentally, later on, when the Israelites are journeying through the wilderness, they come back to the Red Sea, and there it's called Yam Suf. So it's possible that they've already crossed a Yam Suf and arriving at the Red Sea when they're journeying down the west coast of Sinai. That would be when they turn up at the coast of the Red Sea, which is Yam Suf. Make sense?
Yeah, and then so then with the I guess the next thing we want to jump into with that just because I know that we are probably, well, I guess I don't know that we're crunched on time. I just know that we've been going a while.
Yeah, well, I'm all right. I don't need the loo for a bit longer. Don't worry.
Cool, cool. And as long as the audience is eating it up, so as long as you're comfortable, we're comfortable for sure.
I'd like to at least get to the new discoveries in Sinai of the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, because that's something that Doug is a specialist in, and I think it's important for to put an alternative reading of some of those texts for you, so that when you come to interview Doug, you can ask him why his particular translations are better than these ones. Okay, so that would be quite important. So what I suppose what I'd like to do now is, why don't I get out of, what I'm going to do is just let's just escape from this a second. One minute, and I'll just flick through to where I think I'd like to pick up, if you don't mind. I won't do the journey through Sinai because that's something that, you know, it just takes time up. But let me just take you to Serabit El Kadim. So let's just play this. I think this is very important. It's all new stuff, and I think it's very important for your audience to listen to this and to understand it. If we are right to assume that the Reed Sea is on the border of Egypt and the desert of Shur, which they then stand in when they cross the sea, is northwest Sinai, then they will be traveling down the west coast of Sinai towards the conventional location for the Mountain of God in southern Sinai, not the one in Arabia, which a lot of people advocate, which I don't think is correct, but that's a whole different story. But if they are coming down the west side, they come to a place in the Bible called Dofka. Now, Dofka is a sort of biblical version of Dumofkat, which is the Egyptian name for Serabit El Kadim, which is the turquoise and copper mining area in Sinai. So if let me just take you to Serabit. It's about 33 miles from the Yam Suf, which is the Sea of Reeds. Sorry, which is the Red Sea on the west coast there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a two. According to the Bible, it's a 2-day walk. So they have a camp somewhere in the Midbar Scene, which is that region there. And they get down to Rabit El Kadim. This is the terrain. This is what it looks like. It's very barren, very bleak, but there are water supplies. So Du Mofkat is the Egyptian name. It means the mountain of turquoise. And what you have in the biblical version is you have Dofka. So they've left one element out of the name. So Du Mofkat, Dofka. Egyptian, by the way, they don't pronounce the T's in Egyptian writing unless there's a vowel following in the next word. So it would pronounce Mofka, not Mofkat. All right. So it would the name Du Mofka is virtually the same as biblical Dofka, just one element missing from the biblical name. When you get to this place, it's up on a high mountain, and there's a temple there dedicated to the cow goddess Hathor, who is the mistress of Sinai. She's the goddess of Sinai, Egyptian goddess of Sinai. She's also called the Lady of Turquoise, so she's the mistress of turquoise. She's the one who is associated with the two turquoise mines at this particular location. And in those turquoise mines, we found, or Flinders Petrie found them way back, he found some inscriptions carved on the rocks inside the mines and outside the mines in what appeared to be hieroglyphs, but in fact cannot be read as hieroglyphs. It's a completely different language. And I want to show you what this is all about now. So it's the creation of the first alphabet in human history. This is one of the mines, by the way. You can see the turquoise mines. And inside that mine, one of the first inscriptions to be found was this one, which is carved on one of the walls there. As you can see, it's not easy to see. I'm going to make it much clearer for a minute. It's a column of what appear to be hieroglyphs, but they're not hieroglyphs. They are actually alphabetical letters. And I'll try and explain that a little bit clearer to you. So in something you haven't seen yet, which is going to be probably in, well, it's partly in one of the Patterns of Evidence movies, but it's going to be in another one coming up very shortly. This is a recreation because we couldn't get into Sinai because it's too dangerous at the moment because of Al-Qaeda in the northern part of Sinai. So we recreated this scene. This is the inscription you can see that we're going to be looking at, the first one. So the column of text on the right-hand side here, you see the signs here. And then you have the Hebrew equivalents, and then you have the names and the values of the signs. So, for instance, the bull's head or ox head that you can see there is the letter Aleph, and that's what the Hebrew word for bull is, Aleph. Okay, and it's actually our inverted letter A. So if you can imagine that bull's head turned on its side, so the two horns become the legs, that's our capital letter A. Okay. So let's take a look at Nun, for instance. Nun comes from Nahash, the word for serpent, and that becomes the letter N in Hebrew. Tav, that becomes the letter T. Sheen is very interesting because Sheen is actually a pair of woman's breasts. So that becomes the letter SH or S. Let me take a few more. Dalet, originally that was Dag, which is the word for fish, becomes Dalet, which is the tent flap, and that becomes the letter D. Kaf is the hand with the fingers. That becomes the letter K. Mem is an interesting one. Mem is a ripple of water, which is Mayim in Hebrew. That becomes the letter M. So what's happening here is each of the hieroglyphic signs has become a Hebrew word. You take the first letter of that Hebrew word, and that becomes the letter of the alphabet. And once you've done that, you can start to write alphabetically messages, sentences. And that's what we've got here. This is the first sign that we've got of this particular remarkable invention. So let me break it down. We can translate it. So I've divided it up into words for you. So the first word, making from 4 signs, 1, 2, 3, 4 signs, is entosh. And then you have gan, dach. That sentence translates into Hebrew as, I have uprooted an oppressed garden. Now, if the context of this is the biblical story of the Exodus, what is the garden that's been uprooted? Well, it's the Israelite slaves living in the Goshen, land of Goshen in Egypt. And it's a metaphor. It's basically saying, I have removed you from the garden of oppression, the garden of oppression being Egypt, where you were enslaved. And I am Moses. I have uprooted you. I've taken you away from the oppressed garden. Now we're in Sinai. The next bit, mi la'ab bemanach. Now this is crucial. Translation. Who is for the Father? Our Father who art in heaven. That's the terminology used for God in regards to your manna. In other words, you have to follow the Father's rules about how you use manna. You must not store it. You must eat it when you pick it off the ground. Those are the rules that the Father set. And this is what this text is saying. It's actually Moses writing what he is actually telling the people on the walls in Sinai, on the rocks of Sinai. Let me move on to another one. This one was found in one of the wadis very nearby. And it's actually a very important one because it mentions a character mentioned in the books of Exodus. So I'll give you the original. This is the translation. And for the congregation being the Israelites who are in Sinai, and for Hobab, a mighty furnace. Now, Hobab is one of the Midianites. He is the son or son-in-law of Jethro, who is also the father-in-law of Moses. And he is a younger man who is a metalsmith. He's a Kenite. And he is in Sinai helping the Israelites make their weapons of war for the conquest to come in the future, getting the copper out of the mines in this region and smelting it and making weaponry and accoutrements for the tabernacle. These are the smelting works in the Wadi where this inscription was found. So again, it's a biblical name mentioned from the Exodus period, where they are making their weaponry to go into Sinai, first of all to fight the Amalekites, and then to go on into the Promised Land and to fight the Canaanites. This is the last example, though there are many of them. You want to say something? Yes, go on, CJ.
Sorry, I just wanted to briefly ask, because I had actually mentioned this in a debate I had recently on Moses' existence.
Yeah.
It is, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's true actually that once they understand the symbols, modern Hebrew speakers can actually read these hieroglyphics, right?
Yes, absolutely. Michael Shlomo Bar Ron, who is my co-worker on this material, he's a brilliant Orthodox Jewish rabbi, and he has translated these as though it's just reading biblical text. He reads it just straight off. It's so simple to do. Once you've got the identification of the signs worked out, and you know Hebrew, Old Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, you can read these ones. Look at this one, for instance. This is another one from the same location here. It's in 1, 2, 3, 4 columns from the right to the left. They quite often write right to left, or sometimes they write left to right. And you just read down the columns and you identify the signs from the Proto-Sinaitic inscription with Hebrew letters, and you get translations which are fantastic. Look at this one. Let me just show you the letters. They're identified from the original Proto-Sinaitic. And this is what I'm not going to read that because it's quite complicated. But if I translate it for you, this is how it looks. He who bound us in captivity. Now, he who bound us in captivity was the Pharaoh. Is removed. He's gone. He's been killed in the Sea of Reeds. Then their years were finished. Whose years? Those who strayed towards Baalat. I'm sorry about that, whatever that is at the bottom there, but I can probably hide that, actually. Can I? I still think I can. Oh, no, I couldn't. Sorry about that. I didn't know whether I should click that or not. So I've lost my file now. Oh, there we go. Are you still seeing it?
Yes, sir.
Right. So then their years were finished, those who strayed towards Baalat. Well, Baalat is the Semitic word for Hathor, because they called her the lady. In the Bible, of course, you're not allowed to name false gods. So you call them Baal or Baalat. You don't actually give them their names because it's blasphemous to do so. So the lady is the name that Semites used to describe Hathor, the cow goddess, of Serabit el-Kadim, of the copper and turquoise mines, who was also the goddess of Sinai. So those who strayed towards Baalat are the Israelites who slipped back to the worship of Hathor. In other words, the golden calf. So what we've got here is 2 sentences. The Pharaoh who kept us who bound us, has been removed. I've got rid of him. Okay, he died in the Red Sea, in the Reed Sea. Then the years of those who stray towards Baalat are finished. They're dead because the Levites killed them for worshipping the golden calf. So these texts are really relevant to the story of the Bible. They are fitting in, and they're all located at this particular place. So I don't want to go any further on the journey there, but that gives you an idea. Stop screen. That gives you an idea of the power of these Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions once you translate them into Hebrew. And once you get a good meaning, where you have a great scholar working on the actual translations. These are completely different translations to what Doug Petrovich has. But they are, for me, they are much more important, much more dynamic, much more about the story than Doug's version. But then we have different views about how to read them. But this is Michael Shlomo Bar Ron's version, and he is a top Orthodox Jewish scholar, conversant in the material right up to here. He's lived it his entire life, and I trust his readings much better than I do Doug's.
And really quick, I want to just point out, just in to briefly give a example for the audience of one of the things you were talking about, where you were saying how you typically don't see references of deities by their names. So one that you guys in the audience will probably be familiar with is Baal. historically he is most likely Hadad, but
Yes.
they just called him Baal as sort of just a general term, which because Baal means Lord.
Exactly correct. And Baalat is the female version of that,
right.
with a feminine ending. So yes. So they it was an anathema to pronounce the name or to speak the name of false gods.
And so with that, then I think one of the interesting things that we would want to jump in now at this point. Now, I know there are some things that I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that there is right now an absence of evidence for, namely, number one, we don't seem to have any evidence of the wandering period quite yet. And also we don't seem to have a direct reference to Moses himself.
Right. That I believe that's true, because if Moses is the author of these rock inscriptions, then he's not going to name himself, is he? He's I.
Right.
He's not Moses. Okay, in the third person. So I don't believe. I mean, if these are Mosaic texts, and not all of them will be, some of them will be, and some of them won't be. Because the other people are literate or able to write at that time. So some of the leaders of the clans would have been able to write as well. They would have learnt this Proto-Sinaitic Hebrew. So some of them will be Hebrew, some of them won't be. And you can tell from the styles which is Mosaic and which is not Mosaic. So that's important. But so, yes, so I think that we haven't got evidence for them wandering in the desert for very good reasons. If you go to a desert today and you look for the Bedouin, where were the Bedouin 2 weeks ago? You can go to their sites and you won't see anything, because they live in tents. They don't make pottery because they haven't got kilns. You have to have a town or a city to have a kiln, and therefore you make pottery when you're sedentary, when you're living in a city. You don't make pottery when you're wandering through the desert. It's too heavy, it breaks. So you have goat skins and skins to cold your water in. You don't leave any evidence of broken pottery. Therefore, you can't date a particular site because you've got no pottery to know what date it was. So when you will not see anything more than a shadow of the Israelites moving through Sinai. So they would camp overnight and they would move on. They would pick up their objects and move. And like 3,000 years later, you're not going to find anything of that nature. What you might find is burials. And we do find cairns of stones, piled stones with bones inside in Sinai, which may be the burials of Israelites over this journey period, where somebody dies and their bodies are placed on the ground and they're piled stones on top of them. That is a possibility. And you might have Sinaitic inscriptions like the ones we've shown of evidence of their journey, but you won't find anything else.
And to give the just another example for the audience, if I know a lot of my audience is American, if any of you guys are familiar with the Iroquois tribe, one of the most powerful and therefore likely to produce archaeological evidence tribes in North America, you listen to the story of their formation, and everything that the historians know is from myth, because the archaeological evidence just simply doesn't exist. And that's just kind of an example of kind of like what you're referencing, in a much less harsh environment and in a much less distant period of time.
Exactly. You can't expect evidence of everything in the Bible. Archaeology is very selective in what it decides to reveal. So we look for cities. We look for, when we get to Solomon's time and so forth, there's much more to work with. But in the wandering period and in the Judges period, it's very little. Remember that the Israelites lived in tents in the hill country during the Judges period. We don't have any cities of Israelites at that time. So although perhaps Shechem might have been and Hebron might have been, but we don't even have very much evidence there either. So don't expect a lot of evidence from the wandering period through. Yes, you've got it in the conquest, and then afterwards in the Judges period, you won't have very much either.
Mm-hmm. And then so with Dudimos, now that it brings us to another interesting point where, so first off, I know we've discussed at least one of the pieces of evidence that Dudimos might be the pharaoh of the Exodus, which is actually Josephus calling him Dudimeos.
Tutimeus, yes, Tutimeus. But yes, Joseph is actually quoting directly from Manetho, who was the Egyptian priest who wrote a history of Egypt. And in this particular instance, he's writing from an Egyptian perspective. So he names the king Tutimeus. Don't forget, he's also like Artaparnas. He's writing in Greek for his Ptolemaic Greek dynasty of living in Alexandria of pharaohs. So he's writing for the Alexandrian library, Ptolemy II, probably. and he's therefore writing in Greek about a story which is also Egyptian and Hebrew. So in this particular case, he's writing for the Egyptian market because he's an Egyptian priest, Manetho.
Right.
And he says, to Timaeus, in his reign, for what reason we know not, God, and this is God in the singular, which is remarkable for an Egyptian text, for an Egyptian priest to refer to God in the singular, not the gods. God smote the Egyptians, smote us, it says. Okay. Now, what is the smiting? Well, we don't know. And then it says Kai, which is Greek for and. These people of obscure race came into Egypt and took over the country without even striking a blow. In other words, there was no Egyptian army to defend Egypt from these invaders because God had smitten the Egyptians. Now, that to me sounds like the Exodus. And it happens to be King Timaeus, who in Egyptian is Dudimos, who comes 40 years after Kharnefre-Sobekot IV, who was the pharaoh who raised Moses as the prince of Egypt. So you see how it fits together. It fits perfectly if we look at the Greek sources, the Egyptian and Greek sources for the story of the Exodus and the Sojourn period. It's all there. If you interpret correctly, and then you look at the archaeology and you find the archaeology matches in this particular era of Egyptian history.
And then this does kind of allow us to get a little bit full circle in that we started this by looking at when Jericho was destroyed, and now we're arriving at the time of the conquest.
We are.
So Jericho, of course, is one major site. We also have sites discussed, a battle at Ai, battle at what appears to be in the Ajalon Valley, but people might associate more with Gibeon. There's supposed to be an attack at Hatzor, attack at Lachish, or Lachish, however you actually say that. So do we have evidence of a conquest around all these areas, or is it sparse?
It's absolutely all there. Dr. John Bimson has published a PhD thesis about this, and all the sites that the Bible says were conquered by the Israelites, some of which were destroyed by fire, others which were abandoned, they all match exactly in this late part of the Middle Bronze Age, the Middle Bronze 2 BC period, we call it. And the only exception maybe is Hatzor, and that's a difficult one because the lower city of Hatzor has very good evidence of burning and destruction. So far, the upper city, the royal quarter, they haven't reached down to the Middle Bronze Age palace yet. It's still buried underneath the late Bronze Age palace, so we don't have any real evidence of burning there yet, but that might come in the future. They're excavating now there, but at the moment we don't have concrete, firm evidence for the whole city being destroyed of Hatzor. But we do have the southern cities have been destroyed in the Judah campaign that Caleb undertook. We have destructions there and abandonments of cities. The story in Hebron matches that one. The city is abandoned and then bivouacs are brought in. Obviously, Israelites are bivouacking there in tents. There's a cemetery of burials of people who come after the destruction of the city. So they are obviously the nomadic peoples of the tribes being buried but not associated with the city. We have it at Jericho. We have walls that fell down. We have a city that's burnt to the ground. And we know that the site was abandoned for 600 years. We don't have a city there for 600 years, exactly matching the curse of Joshua. So all these places are there towards the end of the Middle Bronze Age, and they're not there towards the end of the Late Bronze Age, in the time of Ramses II. There are no destructions at that time which match the biblical story, apart from Hatzor. Now, Hatzor is different and unique because it is destroyed, according to the pottery evidence, before the end of the reign of Ramses II. And the trouble with that is that if Ramses II is the pharaoh of the Exodus, then it's destroyed before Joshua arrives in Promised Land. Mm-hmm. So that one doesn't really match either. Destruction is probably by somebody else. And in the new chronology, that destruction would have been by the Arameans, who come along and invade the northern part of Israel in a much later period in time. But with the revised chronology, it matches up.
And there's a couple things that it would be interesting to note from my perspective. So the first thing I want to say is just when it comes to Hatzor, it's a little unique, right? In that it not only has the unique point you already mentioned, but also that it was destroyed more than one time, twice by the Israelites and once, as you mentioned, by the Arameans.
Right. Well, be careful, because the second time under Deborah, it doesn't say the city was destroyed. Okay, it says Jabin was defeated. It doesn't actually say that the city was destroyed the second time. But importantly, that the city is revived after the first destruction under Joshua. In the late Bronze Age, we don't have that pattern, but in the Middle Bronze Age, we do, because Hatzor then rises again in the early 18th dynasty and in the late Bronze One, which is when, of course, we have the story of Deborah and everything in the Judges period. So that matches much, much better than it does in the Ramesses Exodus theory.
And then the second point that I wanted to point out, you actually already kind of hinted to a little bit, which is that name Jabin. Now, we don't know. Some people have suggested it might be a dynasty name such as Pharaoh, or a dynasty name such as David, meaning that, obviously Pharaoh being the title and David being the house of. Yeah. I tend to favor the theory that says the Jabin of Hatzor, or of Deborah rather, was trying to almost be like a rebirth of the Jabin of Joshua's day, because he appears to be very powerful, almost like the way Shishak or Shoshank wanted to be a rebirth of Ramses. You actually have argued that we have a record of potentially the same Jabin as the one Joshua attacked. Is that correct?
Yes. I would say the name is a dynastic name. Because we have several texts from Mari and other places from earlier periods mentioning Yabin or Ibni, Yabni. And so it seems to be what I would call a Middle Bronze Age king's name in Hatzor. There is no evidence of any Jabins or Ibnis or Yabnis in the late Bronze Age, when the Exodus theory of Ramesses II is placed. There is no mention of a king called that then. That may just be a look of archaeology. But we do have the name Jabin or Yabni or Abni in the Middle Bronze Age, and with a small fragment of a letter was found in the Middle Bronze Age palace. The part that has been revealed, just a small corner of it, really, not the whole thing. They found this broken tablet, and it has the name Yabni or Abni on it, which is the name of the king that Joshua stuck his sword into his belly and killed him at the Battle of Hatzor. So there, the name matches again with the biblical story. It's another confirmation, like the Beit Dud inscription from Tel Dan is a confirmation of the biblical story, but from a much earlier period. So archaeology is coming up with stuff that works, but only if you revise the chronology. Because in the non-revised chronology, in the conventional dating, the Jabin or Yabni of Hatzor from the Middle Bronze Age can't be Joshua's Jabin, because it's 300 years later.
Right, and of course that would be a what somebody who might be a little bit more scoffery, shall we say, might jump on to say this is an anachronism and so on and so forth, which of course is how we get into the problem we're in now.
Yeah, exactly. How many anachronisms do we have to accept?
Right, exactly. And of course, especially considering the fact that so many things don't appear to be anachronistic. Like half of the time it appears to be correct and the other half not, right? It almost seems like because of that half where it is correct, you'd be more inclined to hear an argument like your own that explains why the other half is also, if not, 100% correct. I know obviously as a Christian and a fundamentalist, I would accept it as, maybe a little bit more straightforward than somebody who's a little bit more just strictly historical might, right? Somebody who might be agnostic like yourself or something like that. But
right.
Either way,
don't forget, an agnostic isn't an atheist. Okay.
Right.
So it's not a matter of denying anything. It's just a matter of not being sure. I'm on a journey like everybody. Those people who think they've arrived are still on the journey, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, and that is true. And I my thing that I think that I really kind of want to hammer home with that, though, is just the idea that, like, there is, even apart from that kind of a fundamentalist understanding, there is still the idea of just taking it seriously as a work, taking it seriously as a historical document. And to give a perfect example from my own perspective, I obviously don't believe in Ares or Athena. But I do think the Trojan War happened, and I even go a little bit farther. I think it's likely Agamemnon and Achilles and people like that were real figures. Achilles appears to be a general who perhaps even had legends about him before his own death. I've often argued on the basis of the criterion of embarrassment that he probably had the Styx legend before he died, and then people were so shocked that he died that they came up with this totally absurd story, because it doesn't make any sense to me, you know. And of course, I run that past some different scholars and, you know, get different reactions. But the point just being that I think the Iliad is a lot more honest than people give it credit for.
It's got a mythological wave flowing through it all the way through. You know, soldiers or great heroes being rescued by goddesses and gods. Get all that out of the story and look at the bare bones of it. Now, if we do the same thing with the Bible, we take the structure, the archaeological and chronological and historical structure. That is the framework upon which Christians and Jews base their faith. That is the evidence book. Okay, without the Bible, there would be faith. The Bible is the foundation of faith. Without the Bible, there would be no faith. Okay, so it's important that we get the structure of it right, and we get the historical context right to overlay the theological elements onto it.
Yeah, I do think that's I actually wanted to ask real quickly, because this will be a good. I think we're about at the time where I want to ask some of the pointed questions I've heard from other people. Not quite the audience questions, but the pointed questions from like Petrus and stuff like that. But before then, I wanted to run by a theory I have that it's not literally a theory in that it's like I've worked it out and have all this evidence and stuff like that. But just sort of a method of looking through history that I have sort of adopted. I'm just interested to know what actual scholars would think about it. I tend to believe that it is more likely that a myth is based off of historical reality than that a myth is fiction. Meaning that if someone were to ask the question, did Hercules exist? Even though I don't think the 12 Labors is an accurate representation of Hercules, I think it's more likely to say he did than didn't, because it appears to me that humans are very honest about when they create fiction. Like Aesop's fables, for example, he tells you straight up it's a fable. Is that a safe way of looking through history?
Not really, because you're not distinguishing between myth and legend. A myth is the creation of a fertile mind. Okay, it's to do with Mount Olympus, it's to do with gods, it's to do with supernatural things, dragons, whatever you want to call them. Okay, and legend is something quite different. Legend is something where a story has been expounded upon that is based on real history. And I would define the Bible as a legend, not as a myth. In other words, just like the Trojan War, as you've mentioned, and Homer already, the stories are real, but in some instances, there's an exaggeration in aggrandizing. In the case of the Trojan War, it was probably aggrandized. In the case of the Bible, it's a matter of debate if there's any aggrandizing in there. And it's up to people to debate that, mainly theologians, not archaeologists like me. I'm just a simple dirt archaeologist historian. I don't get involved in theology because it's not my field at all. But I would say that the Bible is historical. The foundation stories in the Bible there are based on original events, but they are legendary now because they've been told over and over again over the centuries. They've been recorded in documents. They are evidential, okay? But the mythological stories are creations of the fertile mind. They are something different. Mythology is not legend. They are quite separate entities.
So out of curiosity, just on that particular point, would you consider a figure like Hercules to be more legendary or mythological?
Heracles probably was a real hero, but the stories will have been aggrandized around him. That's for sure. We don't, unfortunately, have any written text mention his name, as we don't for Agamemnon, as we don't for Achilles. We don't have anything other than Homer. Okay, and the Homeric sagas, mainly because Greece is not really got any writing. They've got Linear B, but Linear B is more about products and storage and things like that, and text, legal text. It's not about heroic figures, narratives like that. So unfortunately, we're bereft of that. But we do have Mycenae, we do have Pylos, we do have places with these magnificent Megaron palaces to prove. We do have the graves circles in Mycenae, although they're not Mycenaean, they're pre-Mycenaean. They are from the beginning of the late Bronze Age. That's another story. But we have the material evidence. We have the Trojan walls, the sloping wall that Patroclus climbed up 3 times. We have the sealed gate where the Trojan horse was dragged through. We have arrowheads embedded in between the stones of the walls of the fortress. So we have the evidence there for it. We even have evidence for the Greek camp at Besik Bay. We have the tumulus of Achilles. If you want to find the burial place of Achilles, it's called the Achilleon. You know, we have this sort of evidence, and it's real archaeology. Then it's a matter of interpreting that archaeology and taking the legend and bringing it into the light of history and making it into real history.
Yeah, and I have a little bit of personal experience with that. I am actually not to just, I guess, promote something that won't even be probably out for a year or two, but I am writing a book on the historicity of Moses, and to explain the different complications of historicity, I've used Santa Claus because I find him to be perfect. Because, you know, if you ask the question, did Santa Claus exist? Everybody says no, and nobody's wrong. But the person who says
it's yes, he existed.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Southern Turkey. It was a bishop of Southern Turkey.
Exactly, and so and that's kind of the interesting point that I always make, right? It's like if you say no, Santa Claus doesn't exist. It's like, well, it's not that you're wrong, but the person who just said, well, actually, he's actually more right than you are, because you're thinking of the big red jolly guy flying around in a reindeer, right? And that person's never existed. But Saint Nicholas is very real.
He's a invention of Coca-Cola.
Yeah, exactly.
Red and white outfit is Coca-Cola. It's got nothing to do with what the bishop in Southern Turkey wore at all.
Yeah, exactly. And so it ends up being like, I think, a really good representation for people as to what, like, why historicity can be an interesting question, you know?
Sure.
But so to get more to the questions that are a little bit more pointed to what we're saying here today. So the first really important objection I tend to hear, I've heard this now from virtually everybody who has an objection to the new chronology. I've heard it from Kitchen, from Finkelstein, from Petrovich, from Wood. I mean, right, if you have an objection, this is one of them. And it's the Philistines. Now, as a caveat for the audience, according to the modern chronology, it is believed that the Philistines showed up in 1178 BC as the Sea Peoples, or Peliset.
Yeah.
And the logic basically goes, this is already a problem for us because 1450 BC, Moses is apparently avoiding them, and in the Judges period, they're apparently oppressing the Israelites. Dr. Rohl makes this worse by pushing it off.
Go back to Abraham. Go back to the patriarchs. They're around then as well.
Right. And so what these people will typically criticize is they'll say, this is already a problem for us. Dr. Rohl is making this worse by pushing it off even another 300 years. What would you say about that?
Okay. Well, let's understand exactly what's happening here. The word Philistine, okay, occurs in the Masoretic text all the way through. Okay. But in the Septuagint, another word is used. It's aluphaloi. Now, aluphaloi is not Philistine. It means foreigners, people who have come into the region, right? And it's a term that's used throughout the Judges period and all the way through to the period of the Philistines themselves that we see in the Bible. The only place in the Septuagint where it refers to Philistines is in the time of Abraham and the early patriarchs. After that, they're called aluphaloi. Okay, so and the Septuagint, in my view, is far more accurate than the Masoretic text when it comes to these sorts of questions. Okay, so what happens in the Masoretic text is Philistines becomes a generalized term for people of foreigners who come into the resident aliens, if you like, who come into the Canaan region, and usually of Indo-European origin. In other words, they speak an Indo-European language or the Hurrian language or whatever it might be. So we have evidence of Indo-Europeans living in the 5 cities of the Cyrenaean Philistines, the 5 cities of the Philistines in the Bible, with Indo-European names in the Amarna period, for instance, which is the time I placed Saul. So when there's the Hebrew revolt against the Philistines in the Bible, there are Indo-Europeans in Amarna living in those cities who are basically aluphaloi. So the idea that the Peliset of Ramses II, Ramses III's time, are somehow the first arrival of the Philistines is a nonsense. The people were there before that. Their pottery was there before that. Bichrome ware is a Cypriot come Aegean pottery, and it's there much earlier. It's there at the beginning of the late Bronze Age. So all that's happening is that at the end of the Trojan War, these sea peoples who are being disturbed by climatic change and the Trojan War itself, who's destroyed the economy of Greece, and then you have the Dorian invasion coming down, burning the palaces in Greece, and etc. All that disturbance results in a migration of warriors from the Aegean towards Egypt, which is the standard thing that everybody does. Abraham did it. Jacob did it. Everybody comes down to Egypt when there's trouble in the north. Okay, but this was a military group. That doesn't mean to say they're not Philistines. Of course they are, but they're later Philistines. They're not the early Philistines. It's not an issue. It really isn't. And for those people who are evangelical Christians who say, well, the Philistines don't come until the name Ramses III, what did they do with all the mention of the Philistines before that in the Bible, who are well before the period of Ramses III?
And I think that is a perfect response, because a lot of that has even been included in some of my own responses when people ask. Because as I said, I would also take the new chronology, right? And I immediately always respond with, okay, I mean, if they showed up in 1178, you still have problems. So clearly, that's just not the way that this has to work out. Either the Philistines showed up earlier, or there's something else going on here.
If you're an evangelical Christian, right, and you accept that the Philistines arrived in the reign of Ramses III, okay, then you're denying the stories in Genesis. You're denying the stories in Judges. You're saying they're rubbish. They're not true. Okay, so get your facts right, guys, and realize that the Peliset who turn up in Ramses III's reign are later groups of the same people. That's all it is.
And isn't it interesting in a way? This is the same problem, right? We have all this evidence for the Hebrews. They just refuse to identify them as the Hebrews. Same thing here. We have all this evidence for Indo-Europeans in the region. They just refuse to call them these Philistines or Aluphi.
Exactly.
So the second major objection. Yeah. Sorry, were you going to say something?
No. Go
on. So the second major objection I tend to hear is chariots. The Hyksos introduced chariots, they say. So obviously the Exodus has to be after the Hyksos. Now, obviously, you're placing the Hyksos as a result of the Exodus.
Yeah.
So where do chariots come into play there?
Well, okay. So let me give you a little example of this. Dudimos, our pharaoh of the Exodus, we've mentioned already. He had a son. In fact, he was his second son. His first son seems to have died. I wonder why that is. Perhaps it was because he's firstborn. But anyway, he dies, and he has another son called Khonsu-em-Waset. And there's a stela of him in the Cairo Museum. And the text is all mentioning, in fact, that he's a commander of the army. All right, he's a commander of the army of Dudimos. Most likely he died in the Sea of Reeds. All right, but we have this stela of him. And the stela, he's represented sitting next to his wife on a seat, as you quite often see in these types of stelae. Underneath the seat, the wife has a mirror and a jewelry box showing her what she did in life, what she was. Okay, she's a housewife, a lady of the court. She has a mirror and a box containing jewelry. Under Khonsu-em-Waset, her husband, is a pair of gloves. Now, I'm telling you this now, you don't need gloves in ancient Egypt, except for one reason, and that is if you're a charioteer, because you have to stop the chafing of the reins by wearing leather gloves, just like the leather gloves that Tutankhamun had in his tomb for charioteers, right? So he's a commander of the army, and he's got a pair of chariot gloves, which represents him and his role in life. And this is in the time of Dudimos, the pharaoh of the Exodus in a new chronology. So there's a chariot force at the time of the miracle of the sea, when the Egyptian army and its chariots were destroyed in the Sea of Reeds. Bingo.
Yeah, and that obviously is another major one. And of course, one thing that I've always kind of been interested by when it comes to this objection is the fact that it doesn't seem to me that, because people often use Manetho, actually, by virtue of Josephus, to say that it's the Hyksos showed up with chariots. But I don't think that Manetho ever actually says that they introduced chariots. I think he just says that they had them, and it's the earliest reference.
Yes, it's an assumption based on the fact that the earliest visual representation of chariots we have in Egypt is the 18th dynasty. Okay, the Ahmose II, who's the pharaoh who expelled the Hyksos. There are representations of Egyptian chariots then, but that doesn't mean they weren't there before that. And the fact that you have a general of the army with a pair of charioteers gloves proves that they had chariots earlier than that. It's just we don't have the evidence for it. And why would you in the 13th dynasty, when we have hardly any inscriptions or representations of reliefs of wars and campaigns in that period? It just doesn't exist.
And so that definitely solid there. We'll just go ahead and move on instead of beating the dead horse there. So another major objection that I do tend to hear from this, and personally, I find this to actually be one of the weaker ones, but I actually think the answer to it will end up showing why. So I want to ask it anyways. Is on the basis of synchronisms. People will say, well, we have, for example, a synchronism between Ramses and Suppiluliuma. Or no, not Suppiluliuma.
Hattushili, Muatali, and kings like that. Yes,
exactly. Suppiluliuma, I think, is like 200 years earlier. So my apologies there.
He's a Mana period. Yeah, he's a Mana period. So he's Tutankhamun period.
Okay. All right. Thank you for the correction there. So the point just basically being, if we synchronize these guys together, then we have to move all of the chronologies, and that seems to be one of the major objections.
And this is something which I mentioned right at the beginning of our talk today. Yes, the Hittites and the Greeks and the Minoans, all of the and that, for that matter, the Canaanites, they all have to move with the Egyptian dating scheme because they are dated via the Egyptians. That's how they're done. We don't have an independent timeline, if you like, for the Hittites, for example. And don't forget, the Bible actually mentions the Hittites when they don't exist anymore, according to the conventional scheme. Yeah, so you hear about Hittites in the Bible. You have Uriah the Hittite, who David had as one of his commanders. Okay, but at this time in the conventional data scheme, the Hittite empire's gone. Okay, so they are synchronized with the Egyptians, but they are therefore moving down in time with the Egyptians to later periods. So, for instance, the radiocarbon dates for Gordion, the destruction of Gordion at the end of the Hittite period, right, is much too low for the Hittite Empire period. So there's all sorts of anomalies going on with this idea of a dark age at the end of the late Bronze Age in Greece and in Anatolia and anywhere else, where there's a 300-year black hole in history, but we don't have any evidence for anything. That doesn't exist. That's gone. That black hole disappears when you revise the chronology.
In other words, one could say that's exactly right. We do have to move everything forward, and that's part of the point.
Yeah, it is exactly the point. And it's the same thing with the Trojan War you mentioned earlier on. Let's just take a humorous example there. The surviving hero of the Trojan War, when it comes to an end, is Aeneas. He's the one great warrior. He's youngish, but he's the one great warrior who survives the Trojan War. Okay, and what does he do? He gets on a ship and he sails to Carthage, where he falls in love with Dido, who's the queen of Carthage. And Carthage is founded in 825 BC. Okay, that's when it's founded, with Dido as the queen. So the Trojan War, according to everybody, is about 1180, 1190, around that period. So 10 years later, Aeneas sails to Carthage 300 years before Carthage is founded. And therefore, he is a 300-year-old boyfriend of Dido, Queen of Carthage. No sense in it at all. The classical writings and the histories tell us that the Trojan War took place just before the founding of Carthage.
And within a century of the founding of Rome, too, right? Because the Trojans are supposed to be the founders of Rome.
Well, exactly. Aeneas then leaves Dido in the lurch and sails to Italy and forms the city of Lavinium. He marries Lavinia, and then he is the ancestor of the Roman kings, who then become the emperors. And the five emperors of Rome, the first five emperors of Rome, claim to be Trojans.
Exactly. So I want to actually, well, before, so I do have a list of questions here, but it is 2 hours and 42 minutes into this. Sure. So I just want to ask if you are wanting to, go or anything like that, just because I know this is longer than we were expecting.
Well, I would say this. I would say, have we got a few questions you could ask from the listeners? Because I'd like to answer those if they've got any. And then maybe we call it a day, and then perhaps we'll come back and do another session about other interesting things, because we haven't talked about the Alamana letters, Saul, King David, and all that stuff. I haven't told you very much about Solomon and his relationship to Ramses. So we could have another session about that another time, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I am 100% willing with that, and I appreciate the offer.
So is there anything coming from the audience that you think would be interesting?
Absolutely. So some of these are a little, like, some of them appear to be like tongue in cheek. Like, there's one who asked how tall were the pharaohs. I think he's just pointing fun at the fact that you're
small, not very big. We don't forget we have the mummies of many of the New Kingdom pharaohs. They weren't very big people.
Well, and that is interesting too, right? We can actually prove that now, right? Because we do have their mummies.
Exactly.
So there is a person. This isn't necessarily a question, but it's a comment. But it is a comment I think is important. We kind of addressed it a little bit earlier in that you're not necessarily shifting the biblical chronology, but I want to give you a chance to respond to this person's concern anyways.
Yeah.
He says, let me be absolutely honest with myself and everyone. I have partiality for the Exodus to be in the 1440s, but I also like the evidence, open to a degree that facts don't care about my feelings. And of course, the partiality being based in that 480th year comment, I'm almost sure of.
Yeah. Well, let's accept that the biblical dating is basically correct, and we can calculate backwards in time using Tila or one of the other chronologists of the biblical divided monarchy period. We get to Solomon, what about 970, something like that. And then David 40 years earlier. Of course, a lot of 40 years in this, which is a bit of an issue, isn't it? That whether they're approximations, they can't all be exactly 40 years. I mean, that would be just too coincidental to believe. But yeah, so long reigns, whatever. But let's work with the biblical date for a minute. 40 years for Solomon, 40 years for David. Probably big dispute is about how long Saul reigned for, but about 12 years probably is most likely. But if you take the founding of the temple in Solomon's 4th year and you work back from that date 480 years, it gets you to 1446. Okay, some people say 1447, 1446, but I go for 1446 for one reason alone, and that is Joshua's long day. Now, when they attack the hill country, they've defeated Ai, they've defeated Jericho, they're coming to support the Gibeonites who are being attacked by the 5 kings, and there's this long day, this so-called long day. And everybody's trying to explain what on earth it is. Well, I'm sorry, it isn't about the rotation of the earth stopping, because if it did, it would all fall off it. There'd be no gravity. It would be a horrendous disaster. So the long day has to be explained properly. And the long day, the terminologies are used in the text about the sun and the moon and the positions of the two. They are actually Hebrew words which are derived from ancient Akkadian words or East Semitic words for astronomical events. Okay, so the words that are used there actually are references to an eclipse. Okay, a solar eclipse with the moon, which lasted a phenomenally long time. As you know, you've had a solar eclipse fairly recently, a few years ago, in the US. It lasts about 15 minutes maximum, sometimes 6 or 7 minutes. This solar eclipse lasted from midday to sunset. Okay, that's why it's called a long day. Okay, because the sun was born on the horizon, it died with the eclipse and was reborn again at sunset, so making this so-called second day. All right, now if you are looking for, it's all in my next book, so you can read it all there, but if you're looking for a solar event that lasted from eclipse that lasted from midday to sunset, it's an extremely rare event. And it happened exactly 40 years after 1406 BC.
I think that's pretty incredible too, to get that kind of a synchronism. I mean, that's got to be rare.
Exactly on time with the event of Gibeon and the battle. It's exactly 40 years after the Exodus in 1446. So it's 1406, but it took place.
So to kind of, I guess in my, what I would say is quell the fear of the commenter.
Good.
It's not the claim that the 1446 date is incorrect. It's a claim about the chronology of Egypt, right?
Well, you know what it's like, isn't it? Egypt is the sort of high priesthood of chronology. I mean, everybody takes the dates from Egypt. If Egypt is wrong, everything else is wrong as well. Okay, and the implications are huge, and nobody's denying this is a radical theory. This is a very, very big pill to swallow. Okay, and most Egyptologists will balk at the idea of swallowing this pill. But if it has so many benefits and it results in so many positive pieces of evidence for the biblical story, it's surely worth investigating and pursuing. And the idea that you just reject it on the basis that Egyptian chronology is right and everybody else is wrong, sorry, you have to open your mind a bit, and you have to be prepared to listen to the evidence and to look at the evidence yourself and to analyze it for yourself. And that's what I do, and that's what a number of colleagues do. And we're, I'm getting a bit old, but a young generation of scholars are coming along who may eventually decide to accept this when the evidence comes through. And we may still get archaeological evidence to confirm the story, which is more than what I've already produced for you today.
And I certainly personally believe we will. I one of the things that just as a quick comment, I think that we will almost inevitably have to end up finding is a record of Joshua, because it seems to me like he would have been such a terrifying figure that somebody somewhere had to have referenced it. You know what I mean?
Not really, because he killed them all.
Well, that's true, I guess, right? That's true.
If you want witnesses to the events of the conquest, they're all dead and buried. In fact, not even buried. So you're not going to find any evidence from them, are you? Not really.
Well, and I guess sometimes I do wonder, though, like if you had like the Moabites, right, who are they don't get attacked. Well, I don't think the Moabites get attacked, at least, but they are next to the Ammonites who do get attacked.
Yeah.
They perhaps because
but they're not writing at this time. They don't have the Proto-Sinaitic alphabet. So why would they make records of it? You're not going to get it. I mean, I can give you a more roundabout clue that might help you to understand how it works. And that we take you to Gezer, the city of Gezer. Okay. Now at Gezer, there's a very, very famous set of standing stones. You remember those? The white stones all lined up in a row at Gezer.
Yes, sir.
They're dated to the end of the Middle Bronze Age, the beginning of the Late Bronze Age. So that's the time that I've got the conquest happening and then coming in. And Gezer is one of the cities taken by the Israelites. Although they don't seem to have burnt it to the ground. They killed the king and their army, but that's in an open battle. They're not actually killing them actually in the city, but they do. The site is abandoned at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, and there's just a few squatters there. Okay, but one thing that is there is this set of standing stones. Right now, there are 10 of them altogether. 2 of them are small, and 8 of them are large. Okay, now when William Dever analyzed them and re-excavated them, he said that these are covenant stones. These are tribal ceremonial covenant stones, but we don't have any evidence as to what they are. Now, how many tribes ended up east of the Jordan?
I believe just 1, right?
2. Okay. 2 and a chunk of Manasseh. 2 and a chunk of Manasseh. Okay. The ones that came over to the promised land, to Canaan, were the remaining 8 tribes plus half of Manasseh, and the Levites. Okay. So you have the 2 over there. You take the 2 out, that leaves 10. You have Manasseh has a half tribe. They get a small standing stone. Ephraim are a half tribe. They get a small standing stone. Okay, that leaves 8 full tribes, and that's exactly how many tribes invaded the promised land and conquered the promised land. So this is actually a ritual site, a covenant site for the conquest of the promised land by the Israelite tribes.
That is very interesting too. That's a pretty huge covenant site, I would think too. That's got to be a massive archaeological discovery. Well, at least
it was a Levitical city, remember, as well. Gezer.
I didn't see. That's learn something, and I would say learn something new every day, but I expected to learn something in this conversation, so that doesn't really work.
Well, my next book is going on from Exodus Mythal History, which is the one about the the Sojourn, Exodus, and Conquest. It does a little revision of those three with some new evidence that's come along. So, and then it continues on from the Conquest through to the Judges period, and it finishes with King Saul, just before the rise of David. So it has all this material in it. So if you're interested in following up on the post-Exodus story with all the new archaeological evidence, it's going to be in the new book, which I've finished now. I've just finished proofreading it. And I'm hoping it'll be printed within the next couple of months, 2 or 3 months. So it'll be available for people to read or to get it on ebook or whatever you want to do. So some of these things I've been telling you about, like the Gezer stones and all the rest of it, are all in that book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will definitely be one of the first to check that out. I can guarantee you that.
Good.
Next question says, how did the enslavement of the Israelites come about? Were there underlying drivers for this? And we kind of addressed a lot of this earlier, but maybe it's just in brief, a little bit of an overview.
It's essentially that the Israelites were so successful under Joseph that they came to dominate up Lower Egypt, the Delta and northern part of the Nile Valley, and so they were foreigners ruling Egypt, not in an aggressive way, but in an administrative way. Indeed, some of the pharaohs of this period actually had Semitic names, so they were probably descendants of Israelites. And then, of course, we have these Upper Egyptians from Thebes, who are a completely different bunch of people who come along after Joseph's dead, and they conquer or take over the entire land, and they're the ones that enslave the Israelites, because they're not impressed by the fact that the Israelites were ruling in the country when they should have been ruling in the country. Native Egyptians should have been ruling in the country, and they are the pharaohs who do not know Joseph.
And by the way, guys, just so you know, if you want to get like the full in-depth explanation on that, we actually did address that earlier and we probably talked about it a solid 10, 20 minutes. So there is a very in-depth look in that just earlier in this interview. And by the way, I am skipping, just so you guys know, I'm skipping through some of these questions. If I get to the questions that I don't find as relevant, then we'll get to them. But if not, we've been, taking a large portion of David's time here today, so I don't want to, don't think that I'm ignoring you just because I don't like you or anything.
Yeah, it's getting to my dinner time soon, so we'll have to close soon.
Right, exactly.
7 p.m. here.
So next question I have here, person asks, what can you tell us about how interconnected the empires of the time were? So like the Hittites and the Babylonians of Hammurabi with the Egyptians and so on.
Well, this is a question of trade now, really. This is the question of trade. It also, because in the late Bronze Age, there were great kings of empires rather than simply countries in this time. So the Babylonian king, the Assyrian king, the Hittite king, the Greek or Mycenaean king, the Minoan king. These were all brothers to the Egyptians. The high kings were brothers. They called themselves brothers when they wrote to each other. All right. And their main business was trade. Like, you are so rich in gold, Egypt. Why don't you give me some of your gold and I'll send you one of my daughters to marry you, or I'll send you some horses or whatever it might be. So it was a bartering system of gift. They didn't have currencies at this time, so they didn't have money. So they traded. And what these empires were all about were actually trading around the Mediterranean Sea and through the Levant, through the area of Canaan, goods that one country had which another country didn't have. And of course, that's why Egypt was so powerful, because it was the richest country, because it had most of the gold. So in one of the expressions in the Amarna letters is that you have gold like the dust of the floor, or the grains of sand. You have so much gold. So it's all about wealth. Gathering wealth and power is through wealth, and that's why they're interrelated. When the late Bronze Age collapses, it's much more difficult then for that trading system to continue because of the Sea People's invasion, because of the collapse of the Greek world, which is one of the major trading partners. The Hittites disappear, so they're no longer in the game either. So you're left with the Neo-Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonians, so the left of the two superpowers with the Egyptians, and of course up come the Israelite divided monarchy kings in that period.
And appreciate the answer there. So our next question we have here, now this is an interesting one. It's not so much asking to defend your position as to potentially find the problems with another. So this person just asks, why should we reject Hatshepsut being Moses' adopted mother? In other words, is there evidence that specifically indicates not necessarily for what you're saying, but against the notion that Hatshepsut would be Moses' mother.
It's interesting, isn't it? You have to find famous pharaoh queens in order to find Moses' mother-in-law, right? She was a pharaoh, all right. And according to the 1446 mid-18th dynasty Exodus theory that Doug and everybody follows, she would have been the pharaoh when he fled into Sinai. So why would he flee into Sinai if his mother-in-law was there to protect him and she was a pharaoh? It doesn't make any sense to me. You don't have to find major figures in history for Pharaoh's daughter, who was the mother, adopted mother of Moses. I mean, it's just a princess. It doesn't have to be a big name princess. And in fact, she almost certainly wasn't a big name princess. So, plucking these major figures out of history is like saying I'm Napoleon. It doesn't work. They're not always going to be major figures. Be happy with the fact that Ramses II is Shishak. It's much more interesting in a non-entity like Shoshenk.
And I appreciate the answer there as well. So, and this question also pretty interesting question in that this will be a little bit of knowledge as to how we know things when we dig them up. Got a question. How can one tell a pyramid from a vaulted tomb by just the foundation? This being a reference to Joseph.
Good. That's a good question. Okay. This is the archaeologists themselves. It's not me. Okay. So this is the Austrian archaeological team who excavated the site. The first thing is, if you have a chapel on the front, you have to have an edifice, because the chapel can't stand in isolation with a buried tomb. So there has to be an edifice above the foundations. Okay. The edifice is almost square, and you can place a pyramid structure onto that thing. We also have an example from the 17th dynasty of exactly the same plan with a pyramid on top of it. This is slightly later, and it's for a prince of Egypt, but it is the same basic design with a chapel at the front, and then a platform base, and then a pyramid on top. So the Austrian archaeologists have made the decision that it is a pyramid tomb. It is not like the rest of the tombs in that garden, which are completely different shape. They're elongated. They do not have a chapel on the front, and they are a dome structure, which is semi-buried. So it is a completely different phenomenon. Okay, so it is almost certainly, and the Austrians believe this, and I believe it, a pyramid tomb.
And so just to let the audience know, there's like 14 more questions. I'm going to ask 2 of them because we're going to go ahead and cut this short. So I apologize, audience, if I didn't get your questions. Maybe at some point in the future, but I just want to let you guys know. So we'll get 2 more, and then we'll go ahead and call it quits because we did just hit the 3-hour mark.
Good.
So first one, and this is itself a speculative theory. I'm sure you've heard of it, but a person asks whether or not there is good, and of course, right off the bat, I assume that you would reject this on the basis that we've already put forward Enku as potentially Joseph. But this person asks about the Imhotep Joseph connection and whether or not there's any good evidence for that.
Okay, well, if Imhotep is Joseph, then he is before Abraham. So you want to work that one out? So Imhotep is 3rd dynasty, okay, the time of King Joza or Zoza, and that is pre-Abraham Isaac period, because they are the transition between early Bronze Age and Middle Bronze 1 when they are around. All right, so it's impossible unless you want to revise the entire history of the Bible and shove it back an extra 600 years.
And important to note, Imhotep is still pre-Abraham, even in the new chronology, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's got nothing to do with it. And pyramids aren't grain stores; they're solid.
And
that's another example of people picking up famous Egyptians and trying to make it into something they're not.
Yeah, and I think actually too, that's one that I have a particular distaste for, because when I was very young, 14, 15, I immediately jumped on the Imhotep Joseph thing and eventually got, because I have a big mouth and wanted to talk to people way more important than I am, eventually got like very embarrassed when I figured out that that was just not at all reasonable.
It's not possible. It really isn't possible unless you have a revised chronology of something like 800 or 900 years.
And so the last question that we'll ask for today and I think it's a good one to end this on, just in case we do end up having a part 2 at any point in time. What does Dr. Rohl think of the Habiru or Apiru?
That is definitely a prelude to the next get-together, because the Habiru are the Hebrews. The question is, which Hebrews? Okay, they're not the Hebrews of the conquest. Okay, so I'm going to leave you to think about that, guys. So we're talking about Hebrews who fought Indo-European rulers of the cities of the Philistines. Okay, and the Habiru, of course, are in the Amarna period. This is when I put King Saul. Okay, now remember something about Hebrews. Israelites are Hebrews, but not all Hebrews are Israelites. Okay, so in other words, Israelites are the descendants of Jacob. Hebrews are generally displaced peoples, including the Israelites. So in Egypt, for instance, there were Hebrew slaves and Israelite slaves, and the Israelite slaves were Hebrews. But when we come to the time of the books of Samuel and the story of Saul, we are talking about two entities. We have Hebrew mercenaries, of which David had a group of them who went and worked for King Achish of Gath, and they were Hebrew mercenaries. Okay, and we have the Israelites and Saul, who also had Hebrew mercenaries. So when the Philistines attacked the hill country, the Israelites hid in caves, and the Hebrews fled across the Jordan. They're two different groups of people. So the term Hebrew just means displaced people. Okay, they're people who are sometimes military. They go and work for other kings. They go and act as soldiers, but they're not, strictly speaking, all Israelites.
And that will be a solid prelude to a potential part 2. We won't necessarily promise anything, because I don't want to, not like we've actually set any dates or anything like that. But just so you guys know, if we do end up having a part 2 to this, we'll probably start right there with what are Apiru or Habiru, and some of the other talks that would be associated with that, such as Akhenaten and the Amarna letters, so on and so forth.
I'll come back when Doug's had his go with you, because then I can respond to anything that he has to say as well.
I was about to ask that. I was going to wait till we got off the air, but I was going to ask if you wanted to at any point have a response, because I wasn't expecting to have a response, actually, to give kind of an idea how it happened. So what I wanted to do was I just wanted to provide the case for the conventional chronology. I figured if I'm going to be interviewing with Dr. Rohl, and I'm certainly not unbiased, I believe the new chronology, like I said, hook, line, and sinker. So I want somebody to provide, just for the audience sake, the conventional idea. And so I actually went with this Bruce Gore character, who I very much respect. And he said he didn't want it to be anything technical, like a debate where he was actually refuting your evidence. And I said, that's perfectly fine. I'm not looking to have any of the new chronology refuted. I just want to have the case for the conventional chronology set up.
Sure.
But Bruce Gore directed me to Bryant Wood. And Bryant Wood, I figured, my main interest with Bryant Wood, if I was being honest, was actually going to be the conquest. But then he, eventually kind of moved me to Petrovich, and then started talking to Petrovich. And he actually said, not only am I okay with it, but send me your interview with Dr. Rohl, and then we'll do and I'll actually provide an argument. And so I figured at that point, it's all right, well, if that's the case, maybe I can pitch this to David as well, and we can have a little bit of a quasi debate, if you will. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but just be sure you ask him to tackle the mention that Moses said that the Egyptians were all still in a state of dire situation 40 years after the Exodus, and try to get that to explain how that works in Amenhotep III's reign. That's a good question.
Absolutely. Well, and in fact, I'll even, just to let you know, I will be going over this interview to point out certain things, especially when because the questions about the Philistines and the chariots, those seem to be like the pillars on which knocking down new chronology is built. And if those aren't actually solid pillars, then I think that we're in business, right?
Well, again, both Bryant and Doug asked them the question as evangelical Christians, what do they do with the Philistines in the book of Genesis?
Exactly.
Do they reject the book of Genesis? Do they deny the book of Genesis? I'm the agnostic here, not them. So come on, guys, you have to produce an explanation of why there are Philistines in the time of Abraham and the other patriarchs of that period, and also in the Judges period as well. Because in their chronology, of course, I don't know quite how it works, because they have this 430-year Egyptian sojourn. But if they have the Exodus in the time of Imhotep II and the conquest of time of Imhotep III, what do they do with the Philistines that appear in the book of Judges before the Ramses III's time?
And with that, I think that's about a good place to kind of end off. So to briefly recap for everybody, what we've done today is we went through, so first off, we talked about the sort of self-referential nature of chronologies and why synchronisms are so important, and why wrong synchronisms cause the whole thing to be thrown out of whack. We then addressed one of the bigger wrong synchronisms, in Shishak being identified with Shoshank, addressed who we probably believe he is, namely Shishak or Ramesses in our modern lingo. And then from there worked backwards from Jericho to find where we actually have a pattern established, and then made our way through that pattern from Joseph all the way to Joshua. And as you guys can see, we have a very solid, not to name drop anything, but pattern of evidence there, right? So obviously I am very pleased with this interview. I thank you very much, Dr. Rohl, for showing up here with us today. This has just been an absolute blessing for sure, and I appreciate you coming on and having this conversation. And I look forward to potentially doing it here in the future as well.
My pleasure, CJ, and I've enjoyed it too. I'm now going to have a huge dinner to celebrate this 3-hour interview. How's about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. You take care and enjoy yourself and with other interviews, and I'll see you in a few weeks.
Yeah, and you as well. And to the audience, I'll just say, shalom to you all. God bless you. Thank you for joining here today. And if the Lord tarries, we will see you here very shortly.